Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Schechter, and I teach law at George Washington University. We are going to be together for 2 days talking about torts for the Uniform Bar Exam. As you know, torts is a double-tested subject. You're going to see it as part of the MBE. There will be multiple choice questions about torts, but you'll also see it on the multi-state essay exam. That leads me into a series of preliminary and housekeeping observations, which I want to take up before we get down to matters of substance. The first housekeeping observation is that unlike most of my Barbary colleagues, I do not use a note-taking handout. Many of my colleagues will have those for you, but I thought I owed you an explanation as to why I do not use it. The reason I don't use it is because on the multi-state essays, when you answer a torts question, what the examiners want you to do before you get into analysis is to set out the elements of the particular tort in question. Those elements tend to be phrases or sentences. In my experience, writing them or typing them out in full is a way to impress them on your memory more effectively than fill in the blanks. This is not necessarily true for the other subjects, but I have learned through trial and error that this is the very best way for you to kind of absorb this information. Now, that said, let me emphasize something. Torts is not a statutory field. It is a common law field. So when I give you a principle, the principle is my wording. And what I want you to feel free to do is to reword it in your own language. There is no reason to assume that my verbatim expression is the only way to express it. Use synonyms. Now, the reason I'm telling you to do that is because everything we know about learning tells us that if you make the effort to reword things on the fly as you take notes, it really becomes internalized. You capture that material and you retain it in a much more effective way. I'll give you some examples of how you can do that as we move into the material. Second thing I want to tell you, at various points in our time together, I'm going to pause, break out of my role as lecturer, and I'm going to ask you to engage your brains and work a few practice questions with me. These are not going to be particularly challenging questions. I confess to you straight up that the questions on the exam will be more difficult, but I want to see if in real time you can apply what you've learned. Most of these take the form of what I call one-sentence micro essays. So you'll see what I mean when we get to the first one of those. I also wanted to give you a roadmap of the matters that we're going to cover. Basically, there are 6 big topics that we take up. The Barbary lingo for these topics are modules. Now, within each module, there are sometimes subtopics and even sub-subtopics, so you can cut and carve the material into smaller pieces if you like. But the 6 big topics that we're going to take up. Number 1, intentional torts and defenses. And then number 2, the duty and breach elements of the law of negligence. Number 3, causation, damages, and defenses in the law of negligence. Number 4, strict liability claims, including, of course, strict liability for defective products. Number 5, which is a very small little module, a standalone module on the law of nuisance. And then number 6, a miscellaneous topics module, primarily or most importantly covering the topic of vicarious liability, but we'll touch on a couple of other issues as well. Now, there is a 7th module or topic that is available online only. So for those of you who are here with me today in the classroom, we won't be covering it together. But if you are inclined, you can listen to me talk about the law of defamation and privacy online. So what should you do with that? Well, if you've had defamation and privacy law in your first year course, if you otherwise feel comfortable with it, you may be able to dispense with that online module. But if you've never taken that material, you might want to invest the time and listen to that at your leisure. Okay? So with that, I want to turn my attention to the topic of intentional torts. The first thing I want to do is I want to give you 3 overview observations that apply to every intentional tort on the bar exam. The first of these is that when you're deciding if a plaintiff has a claim, the hypersensitivity of that plaintiff should be ignored. The extreme or hypersensitivity of the plaintiff should be ignored in deciding if the plaintiff has a claim. Always assume you're dealing with a normal or ordinary person. Ignore eccentricities. We'll work with that a little bit further on when we have some context. Let me just leave it hanging there as an abstract principle, and let me mention general observation number 2. In the law of intentional torts, there are no incapacity defenses. What that means is that people who lack legal capacity elsewhere in the legal system are nonetheless going to be held liable for intentional torts. Who lacks capacity? I'm going to nominate as a poster child, a child. A child lacks legal capacity to do almost anything. Children cannot enter into valid contracts. You know that. They can disaffirm their contracts. Children can't drink alcoholic beverages. Children can't vote. They can't get a driver's license. They can't marry. Children can't do anything. But if a 9-year-old locks you in a closet, the 9-year-old is liable for false imprisonment. If an 8-year-old kicks you in the leg, the 8-year-old will be liable for battery. What are some other examples of incapacity? Well, people who are intoxicated or under the influence of drugs. People who are suffering from a mental illness or disorder. People who are developmentally disabled. Anybody who might be able to assert incapacity in another branch of the law is going to be liable for intentional torts. So as a practical matter, here's what that means. If you recognize a multiple choice question as an intentional tort question, and there is a choice that says defendant is not liable because he lacked legal capacity, never, ever pick that choice. That choice is always incorrect. Okay? Third and final overview observation. In the law of intentional torts, if a defendant starts out with the intent of committing one tort against a particular person, and a different tort results or a different victim is affected, the defendant is liable for whatever happens. You start out with the desire to commit tort A against person X, but you wind up inflicting tort B on person Y, you are liable for tort B to person Y. That doctrine, of course, is what we call the transferred intent doctrine. The transferred intent doctrine simply means that if you aim a gun at somebody with the intent merely to scare them, but the bullet actually penetrates their body, you will be liable for the tort of battery. And if you try to shoot John and you miss and you shoot Steve, you will be liable to Steve. Transferred intent. The thing about transferred intent is that it's a legal fiction. We call it intent, but to the layperson, it looks like an accident. If you're trying to shoot John and you miss and you hit Steve, that feels like an accident. So they'll give you wrong choices. It'll say he's not liable to Steve because he didn't intend to shoot Steve. In everyday colloquial speech, that's true. But under transferred intent, he will be liable for battery to Steve. So now we are in a position, I think, to turn our attention to the individual intentional torts, the named causes of action. There are 7 intentional torts that you will see on the exam. Each one of them is likely to make an appearance. You're probably going to get about 7 or 8 multiple choice questions about intentional torts. The first one is battery. What I want to do is I want to give you the list of elements, and then I want to explore those elements, tell you about the kinds of things that typically have been tested in the past. Battery has only two elements. Number one, the plaintiff must show that the defendant committed a harmful or offensive contact. Defendant committed a harmful or offensive contact. Element number two, the contact has to be with the plaintiff's person. With the plaintiff's person. So let me talk about harmful and offensive. The first thing, let me just take this kind of almost off the table. Harmful batteries almost never tested. A contact is considered harmful if it causes an actual physical trauma, a physical injury. A contact is harmful if it makes you bleed, or if it breaks a bone, or if it sends you to the hospital, or if it results in your death. That's a harmful contact. But that's not going to be tested, and I'll tell you why it's not going to be tested. It falls into a category that I call too easy to test. It's just too easy to test. They will only test on things where they're going to get a curve. If everyone's going to get it right, they won't ask it, and this is too easy to test. They're not going to give you a question that says, Dave walked up to Pete and shot him in the head. What torts? Discuss. Who the hell would get that wrong? If you can't get that right, not only do you not deserve a law license, you don't deserve a driver's license. I mean, seriously. So they'll almost always ask about an offensive battery. And the question is, what makes something offensive? Here's what I want you to do. Swap out and substitute the word unpermitted. Offensive means unpermitted. And you can just write that as a mathematical equation. You can write offensive equals unpermitted. Remember, notes are notes. They can be short. That's a good thing. Offensive equals unpermitted. But unpermitted to who? Well, the answer is a person of ordinary sensitivity, because hypersensitivity is not taken into account. So let's see if we can come up with an example of an offensive battery. Here's my example. I have a young lady. She's an undergraduate student. She's sitting in her university library. I want you to picture a big, grandiose reading room. She's studying for an exam. Books and papers, computer, all laid out. And I will even give her a name to follow the story. We'll call her Patricia. You'll notice her name begins with the letter P. That is not random. She will soon become a plaintiff. Who is going to come into the reading room of the library but a classmate? I'll call him Dave. You'll notice his name begins with a D. Almost all my defendants happen to be named Dave, with a few exceptions. Anyway, Dave sees Patricia. And Dave is a big guy. Dave is a varsity football player. And he sees Patricia, and he makes his way across the library to where she's sitting. He walks across that big expanse. And he sits down next to her. He says, Patricia, I've been looking for you all day. Something I got to tell you. She says, Dave, not now. I'm working. He says, no, this won't wait. You see, I really, really like you. But as he says this, he reaches forward and he strokes her hair. I really, really like you. She brings a lawsuit and she says that was a battery. She says that was offensive. Do you guys think that that was offensive? Well, I would think that almost everyone would have said yes. And the reason that I would hope that almost everyone would have said yes is that you recognize that to the average or normal person, that was essentially sexual harassment. That was an unwelcome sexual touching. It was, to be blunt, it was a grope. And while fortunately in this hypothetical it did not involve an intimate part of the body, it was nonetheless unacceptable to be touched in that fashion by someone who you don't have a prior relationship with. That's an example of an offensive battery. Although the truth is, you can strip out the sexual harassment or sexual element of that, it's still going to come out the same way, don't you think? What if it occurred to me at this point in the lecture that I had started a little bit too abruptly, okay? I just kind of dive into the material and I'm like, oh, that was rude. I should be a little bit more personable. And so I suspend the lecture and I walk around and I greet each of you individually. I'm like, hi, how you doing? Glad you're here. Best of luck on the exam. But as I greet each of you, I stroke your hair. Hi, how you doing? So nice. You can, ooh, that's very nice. All right. What the hell is that, right? That's like Battery City. We don't do that. That's not normal. We don't pet each other. So you get the point. That's what we mean by an offensive battery. Let me talk to you about element number 2, the plaintiff's person. Here, there is a very, very simple rule that the bar examiners are very fond of. The rule is that your person includes anything you're holding, anything you're touching, anything that you're connected to. Lawyers love giving things names. There's a name for this. I hesitate to say the name because if I say the name, you're going to write it down. You don't need the name, so why would I give it to you? I would give it to you only to bring back a memory from 1L first semester when you took torts. The name, don't write it down, is called the extended personality rule. But it's easier to just remember that your person includes anything you're holding. So if I'm walking down the street carrying a briefcase, if you're walking down the street carrying a purse, and someone forcibly grabs that briefcase or purse, that's a battery. Just to show you how the bar examiners have played with this, I'll tell you a question that they asked. This is probably a decade old, but they had a question where a woman had gone horseback riding and she had lost her way. She saw a pedestrian, so she stops the horse. She leans down and she says to the pedestrian, "Excuse me, I've lost my way. Do you know where the stables are located?" And instead of responding, do you know what the pedestrian does? Well, it's a bar exam question. What he does is he turns around and he slaps the horse on the ass. He slaps the horse on the ass. They wanted to know if she had a cause of action. The answer is yes. She has a cause of action for battery. That was an offensive touching to her person. Because in the eyes of the law, the horse is part of her body because she was mounted on top of the horse at the time that he did that. In other words, in the eyes of the law, she's like a figure from ancient Greek mythology. She's half woman, half horse. It's kind of a stupid rule, but if you remember it, that's one more question closer to a law license. Okay? So let's do a little practice, all right? Let's get out of note-taking mode. Let's kind of engage. This is a pretty simple one, but here's the fact pattern. I want you to assume that you're in a corridor of your law school or of your law firm. I want you to assume that there's a person who is new to that particular building, a visitor to the school, a visitor to the firm. They see you standing there and they walk up to you and they say, "Excuse me, do you know where the bathrooms are located?" Because they don't know, because they're new to the building. But in order to get your attention, because you're facing away from them, they tap you on the shoulder. Tap, tap, tap. "Excuse me, do you know where the bathrooms are located?" Now, it turns out that ever since childhood, you have had a very severe phobia of being tapped on the shoulders. You have a very severe reaction to this, and you go to court and you testify credibly that this was extremely offensive. Will you recover in a lawsuit for the claim of battery? Why or why not? Okay? Now, I honestly want you to actually write it down. Even though if you think it's very easy, just write down yes or no and a 3-sentence or a 3-word or 1-sentence explanation. The answer, of course, is no, you will not recover. Even though it is unfortunate that you suffered some emotional upset by this touching, even though we believe that you personally were offended, that is not offensive to a person of ordinary sensitivities because it is permitted by normal people. Normal people are down with a tap on the shoulder. And because of that, you can't recover. Eccentricity is not taken into account. So let us move ahead and talk about the close sibling of battery. And the second intentional tort on the list, that's going to be the tort of assault. Two elements here. Number one, the defendant must place the plaintiff in a reasonable apprehension. Defendant must place the plaintiff in reasonable apprehension. Element number two, that apprehension must be of an immediate battery. The first element could get you in a little bit of trouble because the word that I used to state the element is a bit misleading. The word apprehension in everyday speech means to most of us fear, anxiety, nervousness. If you use the word in an everyday comment, it might be to say, you know, I'm a little apprehensive about going to that neighborhood. I hear it's kind of dangerous. I'm apprehensive about going to that club. I hear it's a little sketchy. But if you were to look in a dictionary, you would discover that the word apprehension has a second meaning. The word apprehension also means knowledge. To know something is to apprehend it. So, for instance, it is perfectly grammatically correct in English to say, I apprehend that Albany is the capital of New York. But who the hell talks like that? The answer is nobody but pompous idiots and the people who wrote the Restatement of Torts, which is why I use the word. Now, I want to tell you something about the people who wrote the Restatement of Torts because it unlocks a key to a lot of what you see in the Restatement and a lot of the language that we find in the cases. The Restatement of Torts that defines the elements of the claims was the second restatement, and that is still good in terms of its authority under the principles of the American Law Institute. And that restatement was published in the 1960s and 70s. And you know who wrote it? A bunch of 60 and 70-year-old guys. And I say guys, it's not an exaggeration. They were almost all guys. So you do the math. They were in their 70s in the 1970s, so they were born around 1900. So when did they grow up? They grew up in the 19-teens. They were young adults in the 1920s. And who were these people? Well, for the most part, they were relatively affluent or privileged. I'm not saying they were Rockefellers. I'm not saying they were fabulously wealthy, but they were relatively privileged because who went to law school in the 1920s? It wasn't people from the wrong side of the tracks. It was people from the upper crust. And so you know what? Because they were growing up in the 1920s and because they were relatively upper crust, they talked funny. One of them would say to the other, oh, Sebastian, you should come to dinner tonight. I apprehend that mother is making chicken. That's how they talked. We don't talk that way. But then when it gets to the 1970s and they're writing the restatement, they're still using that language. So we're stuck. In the exam, they will use the word apprehension to see if they can throw you off. What you have to appreciate, however, is that apprehension is a synonym for knowledge. And that has two testable implications. Number one, you've got to see it coming. You probably remember this from first year, but in order for an assault to be made out, you have to see the defendant about to do something to you. If I raise my hand as if to strike you on the back, and then I change my mind and put my hand down, and you didn't perceive it, you have no knowledge of it, it's not an assault. If I come into your bedroom and you're sound asleep, I pick up a bat as if to clobber you, and then I'm like, no, and I put the bat down and leave. It's not an assault. You've got to see it coming. But, second proposition, you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to be afraid. Dwayne Johnson is out for a walk, The Rock, and who happens to encounter him but Justin Bieber? And Justin Bieber picks up a stick and says, I'm going to hit you, all right? Dwayne Johnson is not afraid of Justin Bieber. We can stipulate that. Is it an assault? Yes, because you don't have to be afraid. You just have to have knowledge, awareness, or perception that a battery may soon come to pass. So that's how they play with that first element. Now, there's one other thing about that first element that is testable. It's what I like to call the unloaded gun problem. You don't have to call it the unloaded gun problem. You can call it the idle threat or the empty threat. What if they give you a fact pattern where the defendant claims he's about to commit a battery, but it turns out that he lacks the ability to actually do it? Threatens a battery, but it's an idle or empty threat because he cannot actually bring that to fruition. I call it the unloaded gun problem because that's the most obvious fact pattern to set it up. I pull a gun, yo, I'm going to shoot you in 10 seconds, but there are no bullets in the gun. The answer to how to analyze that problem is found in the definition that I just spent a couple of seconds going over with you. Apprehension means knowledge. If you know that the gun is loaded, then you know that you could be the victim of a battery, therefore it's an assault. If you know the gun is unloaded, then you know that you cannot be the victim of a battery, and therefore it is not an assault. But neither of those is the testable point. The testable point is, what if you have no information one way or the other? And for that, you have to go back and look at the phrasing I gave you at the beginning. I didn't say that apprehension is required. I said reasonable apprehension. The word reasonable is there for a reason. It does work in terms of specifying the nature of this requirement. All you need is a reasonable belief, a reason to know or think, and that is sufficient to establish an assault. Is it reasonable to think that a gun pointed at you by an anonymous assailant might be loaded? I'm going to go yes. Many guns are loaded. The point of a gun is to have ammunition in it and to fire. People don't usually carry around firearms just for the sort of aesthetic pleasure of it. And so it is reasonable to assume that the gun is loaded. Now, here again, I can give you a formal legal phrase for this. This may be evocative of something your first-year teacher said. It is a phrase straight out of the restatement. The phrase is, an apparent ability creates a reasonable apprehension. An apparent ability creates a reasonable apprehension. Translate that into English and it says, if it looks like he can do it, it's reasonable to think that he can do it. An apparent ability creates a reasonable apprehension. So let's talk about element number 2 here. Now that we know what apprehension means, now that we know that it is qualified by the limitation on reasonableness, now what do we mean by an immediate battery? The focus here is on the timeline, on the immediacy. And there are 2 different issues that are essentially opposite sides of the same coin. The first proposition is that words alone, mere words, naked words, words by themselves. And remember, you can translate this. When I say words alone, you can hear me and you can write just words. That's a good thing. That's better than taking verbatim notes, okay? Words alone, not sufficient to create immediacy. There must be conduct. Conduct required. You need conduct. If I walk up to you and I have my hands in my pockets and I'm not otherwise making any gestures, and I look at you and I say, you know what? In 20 seconds, I'm going to haul off and punch you in the face as hard as I can. And it's going to hurt because before I was a law professor, I was a professional boxer. 15 seconds, clock is ticking. That does not place you in a reasonable apprehension of an immediate battery. Why not? It's not immediate. You might say to me, but you said 20 seconds. That sounds pretty immediate to me. And the response of the authors of the Restatement of Torts, the response of the cases, is that, yeah, but talk is cheap. And until you make a move, it's not really immediate. Until you actually make a move, it's not immediate. Now, what kind of move am I talking about? What kind of conduct do I mean? I tend to refer to it as a menacing gesture. It is often the display of a weapon. The defendant takes out a gun or a knife or picks up a stick or a rock. But of course, it can be something else, such as drawing your hand back as if to slap someone. But there has to be something like that. Words alone are not immediate because talk is cheap. Now, what's the other side of the coin? Sometimes you can have conduct. Sometimes you can have the menacing gesture, but accompanying words may destroy immediacy. Sometimes words can negate the immediacy. If they give you words and conduct combined, look at the words. See what their natural implication is. The two most common examples where words negate the implication of conduct: number one, conditional words. Conditional words. I walk up to you, I raise my hand as if to slap you, and I say, if you weren't my best friend, I'd slap you silly. If you weren't my best friend, I'd slap you silly. Have I placed you in reasonable apprehension of an immediate battery? In other words, do you have reason to believe that you're about to be slapped? The answer is no, because if you heard my words, you know I'm not going to slap you. The words, if you weren't my best friend, are equivalent to I am not going to. So look for conditional words. The other example, words in the future tense. I raise my hand as if to slap you, and I say, just you wait until tomorrow, and I'm going to slap you silly. Have I placed you in reasonable apprehension of an immediate battery? No. Why? Because I have explicitly calendared this battery for tomorrow, and that's not immediate. So those are the concerns that you have to watch for. Let's do another little bit of practice, okay? Disengage from the note-taking, listen to the question, do a little one-sentence micro-essay, okay? Here I'm not going to use names that begin with P and D. You'll appreciate why as soon as you hear the names. Billie Jean and Bobby are playing tennis. Billie Jean and Bobby. If you don't get the historical reference, Google it. Billie Jean and Bobby are playing tennis, and every time Billie Jean tries to serve, Bobby heckles her. Eventually, after this has gone on for an extended period of time, Billie Jean gets very upset. So she trots across the court rapidly, and she's waving her racket, and she approaches Bobby, and she basically wants to put the fear of God in him and intimidate him, scare him, so that he stops heckling her. But as she's getting close to him, there is some foreign substance on the court that had been left there because the tennis club was negligent in preparing the court for play. And Billie Jean slips, and as she does so, her tennis racket strikes Bobby's hand that he's put up in a defensive posture, and it breaks a bone in his arm. So Bobby sues Billie Jean for the tort of battery. Will Bobby win? Yes or no? Why or why not? One sentence reason for that. I think this one is a yes for Bobby. Bobby should win this claim. The reason, in one sentence or less, is transferred intent. It was clear, even though you might think justifiable, that when Billie Jean walked across the court, she had the intent to put him in apprehension of a battery. Her goal was to intimidate him, to scare him by threatening to hurt him. Obviously, things went differently than she planned because of the foreign substance on the court. She wound up committing a tort different than the one she intended. A layperson Your grandma, if your grandma is not a lawyer, would say it was an accident. But a judge would say transferred intent. And so liability for battery would attach there. And if you said that, you're doing great. Let me talk to you about false imprisonment. Surprisingly popular on the exam, and a couple of interesting concepts to bear in mind. First of all, elements. Two elements here. Element number one, the defendant must commit an act of physical restraint. Element number two, plaintiff must be confined in a bounded area. Plaintiff must be confined in a bounded area. When I talk about an act of restraint, I want to elaborate that by giving you three editorial observations. The first thing I'll say before I go into the editorial observations is that when I say act of restraint, you probably think of a direct physical restraint, or you probably think of a barrier. And those are both more than adequate to satisfy this element. If I literally hold you by the arm and prevent you from walking away, that is a battery, but it is also false imprisonment because I'm holding you in place. More commonly, if I see you sitting in a room and I lock the door so that you cannot exit, that too is a act of restraint. These are common sense. These are too easy to test. So here are three editorial observations that expand our understanding of an act of restraint. Number one, threats are sufficient. Threats also count. Threats can be a restraint. I see you sitting in a room. It's a conference room like you might find at the typical law firm. You're sitting in the room and you're working. I walk into the room and I say, if you leave this room in the next 30 minutes, I'll shoot you. I then reach into my coat and take out a gun to show you that I have the ability to do this. And then I walk away and I leave the door wide open, unlocked. Have I committed an act of restraint? Well, let me ask you the more bottom line question. Are you going to stay in the room? I don't know about you, but I'm staying in the room because you have a gun and you just threatened to kill me if I leave in the next 30 minutes. So I'm going to stay in the room. That threat is indeed an act of restraint. Just bear in mind that it has to be a threat that would operate on the mind of a reasonable or normal person, because hypersensitivity is not taken into account. Hypersensitivity is not taken into account. I see you sitting in the room. You're working. I walk into the room and I say, if you leave this room in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to turn you into a unicorn. I reach into my jacket and take out a magic wand to show my alleged power to accomplish this. You stay in the room. You have issues, but they're not legal, all right? That's not an act of restraint. You're kind of weird. So it's got to be a genuine threat. Now, what in the real world is the most common threat that has sufficed to make out a real world claim of false imprisonment? The answer is, if you leave, I'll call the cops. If you leave, I'll call the cops is usually enough to cause people to stay in place. Do you know who normally delivers that threat? Store security guards, rent-a-cops. Probably half the litigation involves Walmart. All right, you have Walmart security people, and they say they stop someone because they suspect them of shoplifting, and they say, if you leave, we'll call the police. So that's a real world example. Whether they give you the real world example on the bar depends. Some years they may, some years it may be more abstract. But if it's a viable and plausible threat, that counts. Editorial observation number two. A failure to act can be an act of restraint. A failure to act, an omission, can be the requisite act of restraint if there is some pre-existing duty between these two people. Non-action can be an act of restraint if there's a pre-existing duty. Pamela would like to fly from New York to Los Angeles, and Pamela has a physical disability that requires the use of a wheelchair. Friends take her to JFK Airport, and she's met curbside by an employee of the airline with a wheelchair. They take her in the terminal, through security, and to the gate. She's allowed to board the plane early, and they fly uneventfully to California. They land at LAX. You know what happens when they get to LAX? You know what the cabin crew does? The answer is nothing. They wait for all the other passengers to get off, and then they themselves exit the plane, leaving Pamela sitting in the plane, unable to leave under her own power because she requires a wheelchair. They fail to summon a wheelchair. That is an act of restraint. That is just as much of a restraint as if they had locked the plane. And that is just as much of a restraint as if they had threatened her. Third and final editorial comment. An act of restraint only counts if the plaintiff is aware of it or harmed by it. The plaintiff has to be aware of it or harmed by it. Assume that we're roommates, but we're not particularly good friends. All right, how could that be? Well, because you found a great deal on a 2-bedroom apartment and you grabbed it and then you advertised for a roommate and I answered the ad and I had money and I seemed normal. So there we are. And we're sharing the 2-bedroom apartment. We have very different schedules, very different lifestyles. You're a model of clean living. Oh my God, you're up every day at 6, you go for a run, come back to the apartment, shower, have your breakfast of yogurt and granola, go to work, go to the gym, home, in bed every night by 9:30. I, on the other hand, well, I have a trust fund. I don't have to work. I sleep till 11, hang around the apartment playing video games, and then I go out drinking at night. One night I come home at 2 in the morning. I am absolutely stinking drunk. So you know what I do? I lock you in your bedroom. I lock the bedroom door. I think this is hilarious. 2 hours later, however, I have sobered up just enough to realize that this is a bad idea because it's going to get you angry. So I unlock the door. When you wake up at 6 in the morning, you exit unimpeded, no delay, no problem, and you go about your daily routine. But I confess the prank to you that evening, and you're so angry you sue me for false imprisonment. You're going to lose. You're going to lose because for the 2 hours that the door was locked, you were unaware of it. You were oblivious. And therefore, while I did commit an act of restraint, it is like the proverbial tree that falls in the forest with nobody there to hear it. It is in effect erased. It is as if it never happened. I've been very fortunate. I've had a relationship with Barbary for quite a long period of time. And I've visited many different cities around the country to talk to bar candidates. Many, many years ago, I was out in San Diego, California doing this. And I used this example. And during a break in the proceedings, a student came up to me and he said, you lost me on that bedroom door thing. I'm like, well, okay, what's your problem? Starts explaining his problem. I have no idea what this guy is talking about. We were like two ships passing in the night. I couldn't make any sense of. He's going on. It's like, I truly didn't follow. Eventually, the mists part, and I realized what his issue was. He could not understand how there could be a lock on the outside of the bedroom door. All right, this was his problem. And so he's saying to me, well, if you had gotten up, you could have left, right? And I'm like, no, the door was locked. And he says, yeah, but he could have unlocked it. I'm like, no, I locked it. And we're like, I get the fact that bedroom door is normally locked from the inside. All right, it is a flaw in the hypo. It's a hypo house. I put the locks where I need them, but I want you to assume that this bedroom door locks from the outside. Okay, just so if that threw you, I'm like, when it finally occurred to me what his problem was, I was like, yo, tank top boy, you need to hit the books a little bit more. This is kind of crazy. In any event, that's what I think you need to know about element number one. Element number two is the requirement that you be confined in a bounded area. Confinement in a bounded area is normally only going to implicate one testable principle. And that principle is that an area is not bounded if there is a reasonable means of escape that the plaintiff can reasonably discover. An area is not bounded if there's a reasonable means of escape that the plaintiff can reasonably discover. Now, if you were to look at that phrase that I just gave you and render it back into ordinary English as opposed to lawyerese, it might strike you as unremarkable or even self-evident. In fact, let's do that. Let's render that statement into ordinary English. I said an area is not bounded if there's a reasonable means of escape that the plaintiff can reasonably discover. In English, what that means is you're not locked in if you can get out. You're not locked in if you can get out. Well, your answer to that should be, duh. The meaning of locked in is I can't get out. So telling me that I'm not locked in if I can get out, it doesn't really advance the game. But the thing that is most important about the phrase is that double use of the word reasonable that is buried in there. Because here's what they love to do on the test. This is an absolute exam favorite. They will give you a situation where a defendant has confined the plaintiff in a space, but the space is not perfectly sealed up. There will be a way out, but the way out will be dangerous or disgusting or humiliating or hidden. If the only way out is dangerous or disgusting or humiliating or hidden, then it is not a reasonable means of escape, and therefore the area is considered bounded, and therefore there is a good false imprisonment claim. One year they set it up that a man was looking to purchase a home, so he goes to visit the home. I'll call him visitor. Homeowner is there. Visitor says to homeowner, may I check out the basement? And homeowner says yes. Visitor goes down to the basement, and then homeowner closes and locks the only door to and from the basement. So visitor is now in the basement. But the exam question went on to tell us that in this basement, there was on the far wall a large, abandoned, rat-infested sewer pipe that led out to the street. A large, abandoned, rat-infested sewer pipe that led out to the street. And they wanted to know whether or not the visitor had a valid claim for false imprisonment after homeowner locked him in the basement. One of the choices said, no claim because this is not a bounded area because you can get out. Words to that effect. People who picked that choice got that question wrong. That is a bounded area because that means of escape is not a reasonable means of escape. And you'll notice what they did. They tried to make it as obvious as possible. Once you understand the principle they're testing, these are not close questions. They didn't want to have a fight as to whether or not it was reasonable. So they said it wasn't just a pipe, which might be a little bit unpleasant and claustrophobic. They said it was a sewer pipe, which is smelly and disgusting. And they said it was rat infested. So that's pretty unreasonable. And that was a pretty clear example of this principle at work. It's also a pretty clear example of how incredibly insane the bar examiners are. Obviously, they don't know a lot about architecture or plumbing, because why would a sewer pipe end in the middle of somebody's basement? This is a completely irrational thing. It makes totally no sense at all. Sewer pipes should not terminate in your basement. That's a very bad mode of construction. But in any event, I hope you appreciate what I'm telling you. Let me just give you another example. The restatement of torts has an example. It's kind of a silly example, but they say, imagine that someone is working out at a gym and they go into the shower area and someone takes all their garments, and the only exit from the shower and locker area is into a public space where people of mixed sex are gathered. They have been confined in a bounded area because they have no reasonable means of escape, because the only means of escape is to walk out naked. And that would be considered humiliating, at least to the sensibility of these restatement of torts people who are like, oh, I would never go out naked. So you get that, okay? So that takes us, I think, to tort number 4 in the catalog, which I think it's fair to say is everyone's favorite intentional tort. That would have to be intentional infliction of emotional distress. Intentional infliction of emotional distress, IIED. Obviously, some people use mental distress. It's perfectly fine to use either label in an essay question. Either way that it is burned into your brain, that's cool. intentional infliction of mental distress or emotional distress. Let me make a preliminary comment about this cause of action. Unlike all the other intentional torts, this claim can be made out by showing that the defendant behaved recklessly. You don't need to show intent. It could be that the defendant deliberately wanted to mess with plaintiff's emotions, but it is also sufficient if the defendant acted with utter disregard of the plaintiff's emotional tranquility. Now, that point of law is a relatively infrequent guest on the bar exam. It's not that important on the exam. I would normally leave it out, but my experience has been that if I leave it out, someone comes up during a break in the proceedings and they say, I remember from first year that recklessness is good enough to make out this torts. Is my memory correct? And the answer is yes, your memory is perfectly correct. Yay. Okay? It's just not that big of a deal. Frankly, I would put it in square brackets, or I might write in the margin small point, or I might put it in a slightly smaller font if you're using a laptop, because it's not that big of a deal. But now you know, okay? Having wasted your time, or not wasted your time, having taken your time with it, let me just add this one personal observation. I happen to love this one delicious irony about the point of law I just gave you. Because there are 7 intentional torts, and of the 7 intentional torts, the only one that does not require intentional conduct is the one that has the word intentional in its name. That is hilarious to me, okay? Intentional infliction of emotional distress. It's almost like a mnemonic device. The only one that has the word intentional does not require intent. That's whacked, okay? Now, elements, yet again, 2 elements. They don't all have 2 elements, but we're on a roll here. Element number 1, the defendant must engage in outrageous conduct. Element number 2, the plaintiff must suffer severe emotional distress. Outrageous conduct and severe emotional distress. The lion's share of the questioning will be on element number 1, outrageous conduct. There is a definition of outrageous conduct. It is from the restatement, and it is worth knowing because if you get an essay question about this, that's a kind of a long shot, but it wouldn't be completely beyond possibility. It would be good to have a definition at hand. Here is the restatement definition of outrageous conduct. It is conduct that exceeds all bounds of decency tolerated in a civilized society. Conduct that exceeds all bounds of decency tolerated in a civilized society. You can certainly hear the voice of the authors of the restatement in that language, right? Doesn't that sound a little bit sort of 1920s crusty? It's like, oh, Sebastian, did you hear what MacArthur did? It exceeds all bounds of decency, tolerated in a civilized society. You should come to dinner. I apprehend mother is making chicken. I mean, it's just like a kind of a puffed up phrase. Frankly, I have never gotten much value or help from that phrase in predicting how cases are going to come out. It's just a lot of words, but it doesn't tell me anything. Outrageous? Well, that's a judgment call. So what am I supposed to do? Ask if it exceeds all bounds of decency. That's a judgment call too. I will confess to you, maybe the reason I don't get any help from this is maybe I have baggage. What's my baggage? I've been teaching at George Washington University for 30 plus years. That's a long time. I started when I was 12. My long residence at GW might cause you to think I'm originally from DC. I'm not. I'm originally from New York City. I'm originally from New York City. I actually grew up in Brooklyn, and I actually worked in New York City briefly before going into law teaching. And you know, once a New Yorker, always a New Yorker. So when I see the phrase exceeds all bounds of decency tolerated in a civilized society, I got to laugh. Because to a New Yorker, that's a null set. Nothing tolerates the bounds of decency that we are going to put up with in New York. I mean, seriously, you get on a subway, there's a guy sitting across the way from you. He's holding a severed human head. What do? Avoid eye contact, all right? That's the New York rule. What if he throws the head at you? You throw it back at him. You forgot your head, right? You get off the subway, there's dead bodies all over. You just step over them, right? You're like, this is disgusting. They didn't clean up, right? The state motto is forget about it. So to me, this is a bit of a null set. But obviously, you guys are not all New Yorkers. I don't know where you've come from, respectively. Some of you may come from nice parts of the country. Maybe some of you are from Kansas or Nebraska. These are nice states. Maybe you go to your birthday party. Somebody has smeared the icing on your birthday cake. You're like, this exceeds all bounds of decency tolerated in a civilized society. If this helps you, run with it, okay? What I want to do is I want to give you some more concrete information. I want to give you one negative rule and 3 positive guidelines, and then a special case. First, the negative rule. Mere insults are never outrageous. Mere insults are never outrageous. Now, the word mere, the adjective, does some work here. It's there for a reason. Mere means insults by themselves. But the fact pattern is, I intend to distress you. That's my goal. That's my objective. That's my aim. But my method is I'm just going to insult you. So I walk up to you and how do I insult you? Maybe I choose to insult your appearance. I walk up to you and I go, dude, man, you are ugly. You're one of the ugliest people I've ever seen. Whoa, that is a face that sunk 1,000 ships. I got to tell you, you must have got hit by the ugly stick when you fell out of the ugly tree. Could you do me a favor? During the next hour of this bar lecture, could you face the back of the room so I don't have to look at you? And you walk away. You're very upset. You're emotionally distressed. Do you have a claim against me? You do not. Even though I acted with that intent to distress you, mere insults are not outrageous. What if I make fun of your clothing? I walk up to you and I say, hey, I used to have a shirt like that. Then my father got a job. This was an actual insult from when I was in middle school in Brooklyn. This is not actionable. It may cause you to feel very bad. What if I just spew 4-letter words, vulgarities? Not actionable. Mere insults are not actionable. You got to have a little bit of a thick hide. Seriously, if mere insults were actionable, literally, there would be a flood of litigation, the likes of which the courts could not handle. So that's a negative rule. On the positive side, what we have are 3 scenarios that I want to tell you about that act as plus factors. These are not guaranteed always going to work out to be outrageous conduct, but they are usually indicators that the bar examiners want you to decide in favor of the plaintiff. The first of these is where the conduct in question is continuous or repetitive in nature. Conduct continuous or repetitive in nature. Imagine that you're at work and you need to make some photocopies. So you get up from your desk and you head to the copy room, and en route you encounter a coworker. Without any preliminaries, the coworker then comes out with the most vulgar, explicit sexual proposition that you can imagine. Just the most coarse, inappropriate, crude language that you can possibly imagine, okay? It's not insulting you, it's basically suggesting some kind of sexual behavior without any prior indication that you had any interest in this person whatsoever, but expressed in the most disgusting language. You're completely upset. You can't concentrate on your work and you don't know what to do. You're like, should I call HR? Should I go to my manager? Should I go back and confront this person and say, I don't appreciate that conduct? Should you just forget about it? You're almost thinking, did I imagine this? So you finally, what you decide to do is you bring a lawsuit. You say that was intentional infliction of emotional distress. That was outrageous conduct. That exceeded all bounds of decency tolerated in a civilized society. You going to win? I don't know. I think it's probably a hard case to win. As disgusting as it is, I think a lot of courts might say that's not enough. But maybe you would. It's a jury question. Not sure. But what if that happened every day for a month? What if you kept running into that person because you had no choice, because that was the way your workspace was configured, and every time you encountered that person, a same or similar vulgar proposition came out of that person's mouth? Now I have every confidence you will win. That would clearly be outrageous. In the real world, what is the most common intentional infliction of emotional distress claim predicated on repetitive conduct? Claims involving abusive debt collection practices. Somebody calls up, they want to collect a debt. They use threats. If you don't pay, we're going to take your car. If you don't pay, we're going to ruin your credit. If you don't pay, we're going to foreclose your house. If you don't pay, we're going to break your legs. Click. And they get off the phone. One time, maybe outrageous, maybe not. Multiple times a day, every day for an entire month, definitely outrageous. Let me tell you about the second case where we have outrageous conduct. This one you would not, I don't think, come up with on your own. This one is a bit peculiar. It's kind of a legacy from English common law. If the defendant is a common carrier or an innkeeper, just that. Common carriers are transportation companies like United Airlines or Amtrak. Innkeepers are hotels. And traditionally, they are supposed to treat their guests, their passengers, with kindness, with courtesy. So if they do something with the intent to distress a customer, we will almost always tag them with the label outrageous. You're traveling, it's getting late, you haven't made a hotel reservation, and you see a roadside motel with a neon sign, vacancy. You pull into the lot, you walk into the office, you say, hi, I'd like a room for the night. And the desk clerk says, I don't think so, you're too ugly to stay here. That's outrageous. It's not normally outrageous for somebody to make fun of your appearance, but if a hotel keeper does it, that's outrageous. They're supposed to not do that. Third and final scenario where you have a clear indicator that the examiners want you to decide for the plaintiff is where the plaintiff is a member of a fragile class of persons. Plaintiff belongs to a fragile class. Plaintiff is in a fragile class. Three fragile classes that I would call to your particular attention. Number one, children. Little children. Imagine that I see one of you guys in the hallway here, and I walk up to you and I say, you no good, low down, scum-sucking son of a bitch. You make me sick. And I turn and I walk away. You're freaked out. You're like, the torts professor hates me. You don't want to come back to the lecture. You go home, you're like sobbing all day, you miss a week of class, you bring a lawsuit, intentional infliction of emotional distress, you lose. Mere insults, not outrageous. But what if I leave the building and I go down to the street and I see a little 5-year-old walking along the street? Oh, cute little kid walking all by himself. So I say, hey, come here. So he walks over to me and I lean down to his height and I say, you no good, low down, scum-sucking son of a bitch. You make me sick. What's his reaction going to be? Well, he's 5, for God's sakes. He's going to start crying and vibrating and pooping all over himself, okay? And that's outrageous. Now, why is it outrageous? Well, it's outrageous because he's a member of a fragile class, but what's the justification? The justification is that it's outrageous because I just violated a rule that you learned in grade school. I violated a fundamental principle of the schoolyard. You know what the principle is? Pick on somebody your own size. My decision to target a 5-year-old is outrageous, independent of this particular 5-year-old's characteristics or independent of his reaction. It could turn out that he's the most badass 5-year-old in the world. He could say, screw you, old man, and walk away. I'm still outrageous. He might fail in his claim because he doesn't have severe distress, but I'm outrageous for targeting a kid. Pick on someone your own size. Second example of a fragile class, elderly people. There is no bright line test. Please don't ask me during a break. I can't give you an age cutoff. We're talking very elderly, infirm, right? I go out, I leave the building. There's an 82-year-old lady walking down the street. She's got a walker. She's very frail. I say, ma'am, may I have a word? And she says, yes. And I lean in and I say, you no good, low down, scum-sucking son of a bitch. You make me sick. And I turn and I walk away. What's her reaction going to be? Pretty much the same as the 5-year-old. She's going to start vibrating and crying and pooping on herself too, okay? And again, it's irrelevant what her reaction is. For the purposes of this narrow element, I'm outrageous for picking on her. Elderly people. Third and final category here, pregnant women. Pregnant women. I have no hypos because I'm in enough trouble. Make up your own hypos of people being mean to pregnant women. People started asking me a couple of years ago, does the defendant have to know that the woman in question is pregnant? I think what happens is one person asks a question and then they kind of like, they're texting this to other people. So now I get the question from multiple people. Yes, the answer is yes. Of course you have to know that the woman is pregnant. Duh. That's just common sense, right? Think about it. Just think about these rules in context. These rules actually do make sense. This is not a secret cause of action that we give to women during their first trimester. You go out to a restaurant, you're 2 months, 3 months pregnant, you don't have your baby bump yet, but the waiter is rude to you and you're like, gotcha. I got my little tort baby inside here, ka-ching. No, that's kind of stupid. The woman has to be very large so that you know, and then you're like, get out of my way, you fat cow, or something. Oops, there's the hypo. That would be outrageous, okay? Because again, pick on somebody your own size. In this case, she's bigger than you, but in any event, pick on somebody your own size. All right, so that's the basic structure of the outrageous element. There is a special case I want to tell you about, and I do want to talk about element number 2, but here's the deal. I think you people have been sitting for a while, so for those in the room, we are going to take a pause. For those of you watching and playing the game at home, you can take a pause whenever you like, okay? So we'll be back in 10.
This marks the beginning of a 10-minute break. The 10-minute break is ending.
As I indicated, there is one further special scenario involving the outrageousness element in the intentional infliction tort that I want you to know about. And I want you to know about it because it is a very popular test scenario. That scenario is that if a defendant has advance information that the plaintiff has a particular emotional sensitivity or weakness, defendant has advance information that plaintiff has some kind of emotional weakness, an emotional sore spot, then targeting that emotional weakness is itself outrageous. You're at lunch with a coworker. It's not a business lunch. You just happen to decide to grab a bite together. Conversation is meandering over topics, sports and politics. And then somebody mentions a radio broadcast that they recently heard about phobias. And your coworker says, yeah, I have a phobia. And you say, really? What's your phobia? And he says, I'm almost embarrassed to admit. And you say, well, you can tell me. And your coworker says, well, I'm deathly afraid of kittens. Kittens freak me out. I know it's weird. Everyone thinks they're adorable, but they just creep me out. The next day, he's at a meeting, and you know what you do? You go out and you get a little basket, and then you get 3 little baby kittens, and you take that straw basket and you put the basket with the 3 kittens right on his desk. He comes back, he sees the kittens, he has a heart attack, sues you for intentional infliction of emotional distress. You're liable. That is an example of exploiting a piece of information that you had about his eccentricities. This is, in a sense, a violation of the principle that hypersensitivity doesn't count. Hypersensitivity normally doesn't count. But if you know of the hypersensitivity and you deliberately try to use it as a button, this is outrageous. I apologize to those of you who are only children. I apologize to those of you who have no siblings. But for those of you who do have siblings, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because if you have a sibling, you know where their buttons are and they know where yours are. And what they do to drive you insane, no one else in the world knows and no one else will do. But when they do it, it's outrageous. Okay? So that's the theory. I want to talk to you about element number 2 here. Not that heavily tested, but it does come up. And that is the requirement that the plaintiff suffer severe emotional distress. There are 2 things I want you to know about this. Number 1, no specific evidence is required. The plaintiff doesn't have to offer any particular type of evidence. When I say no specific evidence, you have to offer evidence, but no particular kind or category of evidence is mandated. In other words, you don't have to prove that you lost work. You don't have to prove that you went to see a psychiatrist. You don't have to prove that you're on anti-anxiety medication. You don't have to prove that you developed physical symptoms. You can establish your severe distress however you want. You may offer any of the evidence I just mentioned, but you're not obligated to do so. In theory, you could just testify in a summary fashion. Your lawyer could say, and what was your reaction to the defendant's conduct? And you could say, I was severely distressed. And then your lawyer could say, no further question. I don't recommend that as a practical matter because then you'll be ripped to shreds on cross-examination. On cross-examination, the other lawyer will say, well, could you tell the jury how many days of work you've missed? And you'll say, none. And then the other lawyer will say, could you list all the medications you're taking to deal with your emotional distress? And you'll say, none. And in short order, you'll look like an idiot. But the bottom line is there is no specific evidentiary requirement here. So if there's a choice that says plaintiff will lose because plaintiff failed to offer evidence of psychiatric treatment, plaintiff failed to offer evidence that he missed work because of this, that's incorrect. The other aspect of the severe distress issue is really more in the nature of a test-taking advice item than it is in the nature of substantive law. Very often, when they test on this element, what they will do is they will negate the element in the fact pattern, in the body of the question. And the way they will do that is they will stipulate to its opposite. But they're going to do it very subtly. And you have to read very carefully in order to pick it up. Let me give you the example. They write you a nice long fact pattern. The bulk of the fact pattern involves the defendant's conduct. And your mind is engaged in assessing, is it or is it not outrageous? Near the end of the problem, they say something like, Patricia was mildly annoyed by this conduct, so she filed a lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress. The dispositive words there, the key words there, are the two words mildly annoyed, because to be mildly annoyed is the opposite of being severely distressed. If it's mild, then by definition, it's not severe. She's going to lose. They just stipulated to the opposite. Now, they can use almost an endless number of phrases, right? You all know that there are synonyms. I've been urging you to use synonyms in your note-taking. So they can say, instead of mildly annoyed, they can say momentarily upset, briefly irritated, slightly chagrined. I don't know what they'll say. They've got a thesaurus. They can write it 50 ways to Sunday, but they will negate the element. And not only that, here's what I want you to know about this. This method of writing questions is pervasive throughout the entire multi-state exam. All 7 subjects, all 200 questions. Once you are aware of it as a drafting technique, you will see it all over the place. I'll give you an example from an area outside of torts, all right? Here's a subject that I know almost nothing about, the law of adverse possession in property. The only thing I remember about adverse possession is that the person claiming by adverse possession must hold the land in an open and notorious fashion. So you know what they'll do? They'll write a big long fact pattern with a big complicated set of facts, and somewhere in there it'll say, and John moved onto the property and lived there secretly for the next 30 years. Lived there secretly. The one word secretly stipulates to something that is the opposite of what has to be shown. So that in and of itself provides the answer. There's another way I can make this point. It's a bit of a sermon, and I apologize for interjecting a sermon, but the multi-state exam is 50%, nothing more or less than a test of reading comprehension. The people who read carefully pass, and the people who read quickly and skip over things hurt themselves, and they are unsuccessful. Whether or not that's justified is a conversation for another time and place, but I do want to stress to you that as you get deeper and deeper into your preparation, you want to practice the art of moving at a good and steady clip, being attentive to the clock, because it is time pressured, but in doing that, making sure you read every word, looking for these buried things that are actually the keys to the answer. Okay? So that's the story with regard to intentional infliction of emotional distress, and it takes me to the 5th intentional tort, trespass to land. There are 2 elements to trespass to land. I know we're on a 2-element roll. That's going to change. The first of them is that the defendant must commit an act of physical invasion. The defendant must commit an act of physical invasion. Element number 2 is that invasion must be of the plaintiff's land. Element number 1 can be satisfied in either of 2 ways. There are 2 different ways that a defendant can physically invade, either of which is sufficient. The first is you go on somebody else's property. You enter the land. You walk on the land. You drive on the land. You enter the property. This is just what your common sense has always told you trespassing is all about. You know that. There is, however, the following exam curly Q exam trap. A defendant is not necessarily required to know that he or she has crossed a boundary line. The defendant does not have to know that he or she has crossed a boundary line. Doug is hiking. He's just on a day hike. He's by himself. He's in a state park. He certainly is allowed to be in the state park. It's public land, and he's on a hiking trail. He comes to a fork in the trail, and he decides to bear right. After a mile, he has left the state park. He is now on private property owned by a farmer named Pete. However, there was no fence or gate. There was no sign. There wasn't even a natural topographical barrier such as a stream that might have signaled to him that he had left the park. He is nonetheless liable for the tort of trespass to land. That is sufficient to make out the tort. Now, a lot of people are baffled by this rule because they say, okay, it's the rule, you're telling me it's the rule, but I thought this had to be intentional. And the answer, it is intentional, because he got to that location intentionally. He put one foot in front of the other, and he meant to be there. Contrast this situation. Daniel is walking down a street one day when he has a heart attack, and he falls on Pete's front lawn. Daniel is not liable for a trespass. He lacks intent. He physically invaded the land, but he didn't get there on purpose. So you have to get there on purpose, but you don't need to know you crossed a boundary line. I'm probably beating a dead horse, but let me make this same point another way. In the view of tort law, it is your responsibility when you move in the world to know where the boundary lines are located. Property owners are not obligated to mark their property. It's your responsibility to know where the boundaries are located. To put it the way a New Yorker would put it, gonna go for a hike? Buy a map. It's your obligation to know where the boundary is. So I said there are two different ways you can physically invade land. The other way you can physically invade land is to throw something on the land, to throw or project something onto the property. Again, this is entirely intuitive. You're standing on your own front porch, you pick up a rock and you throw it through your neighbor's window. Everyone knows you have to pay for the window. Why do you have to pay for the window? What's the cause of action? Trespass to land. You intentionally invaded the land. You didn't go on the land, but you threw the rock on the land. Exam trick here. The thing that you send onto the land, it's got to be tangible. It's got to be physical. We have to be able to touch it and feel it. If you project unpleasant, intangible things onto somebody else's land, that's not a trespass. So what would that be? Well, maybe you shine bright lights in your neighbor's windows on purpose to torture him. Not a trespass. What if you deliberately make loud noises? You buy giant concert speakers and blast music all night onto your neighbor's property to drive him insane. Not a trespass. These things, if they are actionable, come under the law of nuisance, which we will take up in due course, but that's not what we're involved with right now. It's got to be a physical invasion. So that takes me to element number two. Element number two is the requirement that this invasion must relate to land. Well, of course it must relate to land. That's the name of the tort, trespass to land. But the specific requirement here is that, or the specific nuance here, is that land includes the air above and the soil below, out to a reasonable distance. An occupier of property doesn't only own the surface. They own a vertical column of space that extends up into the air and down below the ground. Any penetration into the column is considered a trespass. Now, if an airplane flies over your backyard, that's not a trespass. That's not a trespass because even though they're invading the airspace directly above your backyard, that's beyond a reasonable distance. But if you have a little boy who lives next door to you, and he takes a ball and he throws it across your backyard, and the ball sails through the air, touches nothing, does no harm, doesn't even touch a leaf on a tree, and lands in the public street on the far side of your property, that little boy will be liable for trespass. He penetrated your airspace with a physical object. That is a technical trespass. So there you have it, trespass to land, and that takes me to the final two torts on our list, which we will take up together. And we will take them up together because they relate to the exact same subject matter. They are called trespass to chattels and conversion. Trespass to chattels and conversion. Let me spell the word chattels. It's a bit of an old English law word. Not everybody familiar with it. It's C-H-A-T-T-E-L-S. Trespass to chattels and conversion both involve an intentional interference with the plaintiff's personal property. The two-word phrase personal property is a synonym for chattels, and it means all your stuff, everything you own except land and buildings. It's your car and your bike and your boat and any other vehicles you may own. It's your couch and your bed and your desk and any other furniture you may own. It's your hat and your coat and your gloves and any other clothing you may own. It's the currency in your wallet, the bills, the actual paper money, the Benjamins, or if you're a typical bar candidate, the Georges, or whatever it may be, right? That's personal property. There are two ways somebody can interfere with your personal property. The first is they can deliberately damage it. They can bend it or break it, scratch it or crush it, throw it in the fire. Second, they can interfere with your personal property by taking it away from you. They can steal it, they can rob it, and abscond with it. So to put this in kind of normal speech, the two torts that we are talking about are the private remedies, the private civil money damage remedies for vandalism and theft of your stuff. Somebody vandalizes your car. If you can find them and if they have money, you will sue them for one of these claims. Somebody steals your wallet, you can find them, you'll sue them for one of these claims. Question, really the only question that they test on is what's the difference between the two claims? And that difference is going to turn on the magnitude of the interference. If the degree of interference is significant, if it is great, then the appropriate cause of action is conversion. If the magnitude is relatively slight, then the appropriate cause of action is trespass to chattels. You really just have to remember that. There's no good way to remember it. I mean, it's kind of slightly counterintuitive. The longer name is the smaller harm. Trespass to chattels, small harm. Conversion, the short name, big harm. But that's not very helpful, I suppose. The dividing line between small and big harm is subjective. If you were first-year law students, you'd be very uncomfortable with that. But you're not. You're bar candidates, and so you're all comfortable with it. On the exam, it's going to be pretty extreme. It's either going to be a pretty modest harm or it's going to be a pretty grievous harm. You'll know the difference, okay? Now, why are there two torts? Why not just treat all this under a same and similar label? Well, the answer is that conversion plaintiffs get a special remedy. If it is categorized as conversion, you are not limited to recovering costs of repair. Instead, you can recover the full market value of the item in question. Full market value. I walk out of my office, I walk out of the building at George Washington University one Friday, and I am in a foul mood. Oh, I am in a foul mood because we just had a faculty meeting. We have our faculty meetings on Fridays, calculated to ruin the weekend, and I am in a particularly foul mood because I had a proposal on the agenda to make torts a 14-credit course, and it was voted down. But the reason I'm in a foul mood is not because it was voted down. I knew it was going to get voted down. The reason I'm in a foul mood is that one of my colleagues had promised me he would support it and vote for it, and then he gets up at the meeting and he speaks against it, stabs me in the back, Benedict Arnold. So as I walk out onto the faculty parking lot, I look around and I see this guy's car. So you know what I do? I walk up to his car and I reach into my pocket. I take out my key ring. I find the sharpest key that I have, and I scratch a line in the paint on the hood of his car. I key his car. because that's the way we roll at GW. Well, he finds out that I did that and he catches me. He sues me. What tort? Big harm or small harm? That's a small harm. That's pretty clearly a small harm. Trespass to chattels. What's his remedy? Cost of repair. Take that thing to a body shop or a paint shop. Cost $800 to fix it, whatever it may cost. I got to pay that. Change the hypo. I see his car. I'm so angry, I go to my own vehicle, where I have in the trunk a sledgehammer. I return to his vehicle. I bang in 2 body panels and I smash the windshield. What tort is that going to be? That's going to be conversion. That's pretty big harm. So I admit liability and I offer to pay for the repairs. Take that to the body shop, take that to the glass shop. It's $6,000. Here, I'll give you $6,000. He's entitled to say, I don't want that one anymore. Why don't you keep it and give me 25 grand? Because 25,000 is the book value of the car. That is its current market value. You damaged it so much that I don't want it back. In effect, the law of conversion is summed up by the little cards that you've probably seen on shelves at souvenir stands in tourist attractions all over the world. And what do those little signs say? They say, you break it, you bought it. You break it, you bought it. And that's kind of the law of conversion. If you seriously damage it, you bought it. One final thought about these 2 torts. A mistake about ownership of the item will not get the defendant off the hook. Defendant remains liable. You walk away from your workstation at the library and then you return. You go to your computer, but it just won't start up. You're putting in your password, it won't recognize your password. The damn thing is just annoying the hell out of you, so you pick it up and you hurl it at the wall. Somebody then walks up to you and says, excuse me, why did you just throw my computer at the wall? You sheepishly realize that you went back to the wrong desk or the wrong chair. It wasn't your computer, but it looked just like your computer. It was the same Apple or other computer that everybody else had. You're like, oops, sorry. That is still going to be conversion. You still have to pay that person for the computer. You acted intentionally. Your mistake in thinking that it was yours will not absolve you. All right? So, time for another practice question. Time to get you out of note-taking mode and into brain-engaged mode. Listen and then write, okay? Here again, I'm using names that are designed to be evocative to help you follow the story. Dusty works as a crop duster. That means that he uses airplanes and flies at low altitudes spraying pesticide on agricultural products, okay? Dusty typically uses a county map to identify the land that he has been hired to spray. A farmer named Chester hired Dusty, and Chester's parcel of land is parcel number 148. But when Chester sent an email to Dusty to confirm the arrangements, he made a typographical error. And he said, so it's great, it's agreed, you'll spray parcel 184 instead of 148. It's just a little switch of numbers. So Dusty goes out and he sprays this other parcel, which happens to be owned by a different farmer named Roscoe. I'm giving these people farmer names. This is what I think of. This is what a New Yorker thinks a farmer is called. So he sprays Roscoe's land. Who is Roscoe? Roscoe is a farmer who sells organic produce. So he's away this day, but when he comes back, he realizes his crops have been sprayed. He informs his buyers, organic markets, and they're all like, we don't want your stuff. So he destroys his stuff, and he sues Dusty for trespass to land. Will he win? Yes or no? So write it down. Just write it down. Then you can just throw this away, but write it down. And why or why not? He will win because, he will lose because. Roscoe should win this one. Roscoe should win because we have a physical invasion of the land. The physical invasion, of course, is entering the property, and it counts even though it was not on the surface of the property, it penetrated the airspace. The fact that this was done out of an honest mistake, the fact that Dusty acted based on bad information that he got from Chester, the first farmer who hired him, is of no moment, because a mistake about entering into the property does not immunize you from liability. The harm done here, although it did involve Roscoe's decision to destroy the crops, was a harm that naturally flowed from the trespass, and so it is recoverable. So if you said that, bravo, you got the principle, and if not, you just heard me explain it, and you will get it right on the test. And that is the end of our catalog of 7 intentional torts. It remains for us now to turn our attention to affirmative defenses. There are 3 affirmative defenses in the law of intentional torts. The first and most important of which, in my opinion, is consent. Consent is a defense to all 7 of the intentional torts. The very first consideration that you have to ask yourself in a consent problem is, did the plaintiff have legal capacity? You have to have capacity to give a consent. This is arguably asymmetric. In fact, it is. When I say arguably, it is asymmetric with the rule that we had at the very beginning of our time together. The rule that I started with is that you don't need capacity to commit a tort, but you do need capacity to give consent. Consider 2 mirror image situations. You walk into a bar to have a beer after work, and there's another patron who's absolutely stinking drunk. The drunk patron walks up to you and punches you in the face. Is the drunk liable for battery? Absolutely. No question about it. Incapacity, no defense. But what if that drunk walks up to you and he says, "You think you're so tough? Go ahead and hit me." Don't do it. Because even though those words seem to signal consent, he lacks capacity to consent. I don't think this is a hard proposition. I think you all understand this, right? If I said to any of you, even before you heard me give the principle, if I said to you, I have a developmentally disabled individual, somebody who has mental functioning equivalent to that of a very young child, a 5 or 6-year-old, he's walked into a hospital and he's asked to have cosmetic surgery. He's asked to have an operation on his face just to improve his appearance. Can he give a valid consent to surgery? I'm quite certain you would say no. No. His limited mental capacity makes that impossible. A 12-year-old child cannot consent to sexual intercourse. If this is news to anyone in the room, please see me after class. You need to talk, or you wind up on TV, or worse. All right? Now, let me qualify this principle ever so slightly by saying that individuals who have limited mental capacity may still be able to consent to those things that they're capable of understanding. Children and those with mild mental disabilities are able to consent to certain things. 2 11-year-old boys can agree to wrestle with each other. And if in the course of the wrestling match, one of them puts the other in a headlock, that battery claim will fail because they have consent. They agree. Let's wrestle. Okay, it's a deal. But 11-year-olds can't consent to surgery. 11-year-olds can't consent to more grievous or consequential interferences. So just be attentive to the fact that it is a sliding scale, and it turns on the nature of the conduct that is at issue. Now, assuming that I have a plaintiff with legal capacity, I will call this person occasionally, I will say it's a sane and sober adult. So by that I mean somebody who has full legal capacity. There are 2 different kinds of consent. The first kind of consent is express consent. As the label suggests, express consent is an outright grant of permission to the defendant. in explicit words to behave in a way that would otherwise be a tort. It's an explicit or outright or direct grant of permission. It could be oral or it could be written. And in its simple form, express consent falls into the category too easy to test. In order to write a problem about express consent, they have to give you the words that the plaintiff uttered. They have to tell you that at some point the plaintiff said, yes, you may punch me in the face. Once they give you those words, it's almost impossible to get the question wrong. So what they tend to test on is an exception. Now, this exception is an exception to all types of consent. I am doing it with regard to express consent because that's where it comes up more often on the exam. But this could also be an exception to all kinds of consent. And the exception is if the consent was obtained through fraud or duress. If the consent was obtained through fraud or duress, then the consent is void. You're at your doctor's. You've been told to go in an exam room and to disrobe down to your underwear. So you're sitting there feeling kind of foolish, and then the door opens. But it's not your doctor. It's somebody that you don't recognize. And this individual says, hi. And you say, who are you? And this individual says, I'm Dr. Jones. And you say, well, where's my regular doctor, Dr. Smith? And Jones says, Dr. Smith was called away on an emergency. He's at the hospital. I'm covering his cases today. How can I help you? And you say, well, I have these abdominal pains. They come and they go, but when I have them, they are really bad. I mean, like I'm doubled over with pain. You got to figure out what's wrong with me. So Jones says, well, I'll do my best. What I would like you to do is I'd like you to lie down on the examining table. And what I would like to do is I'd like to press down fairly firmly on your abdomen. Is that okay? I'm going to have to use a fair amount of force. And you say, yes, of course, press down as hard as you'd like. Just figure out what's going on. So you're lying there and Jones is doing his thing, when suddenly the door to the exam room flies open. It's your doctor, Dr. Smith. And you know what he says? He says, Jones, take your hands off that patient, take off that medical coat, and go back to the cafeteria where you work as a cafeteria employee. Stop impersonating a doctor. Because it turns out that Jones is not a doctor. It turns out Jones is just a cafeteria employee who gets his jollies from touching people's abdomens. So what you do is you sue Jones for battery. You say that was offensive. That would not be permitted by a person of ordinary sensitivity. But in that lawsuit, Jones comes to court. And when he's not playing doctor, he likes to play lawyer. He defends himself and he says, express consent. I asked you if I could touch your abdomen. You said yes, press as hard as you want. What's the rebuttal? What will you say in response to the express consent? What you will say is fraud. Basically, what you will say is, you tricked me. You got that consent by telling me a lie. And I would never have given the consent if I had known that you were not a medically trained person. You will win. Your consent will be disregarded. That is a battery. Excuse me. So that's that particular type of scenario. Consent that is fraudulently procured is sometimes fraudulently procured not by an affirmative misrepresentation, but by a failure to disclose. So you can also have fraudulent consent by a failure to disclose. There are a number of cases where individuals engage in a one-night stand, a casual sexual encounter. One of them has a sexually transmissible disease, but they don't share that information with their partner of the evening, and that is then transmitted to the other person who sues for a battery. Then there's an argument that the sex was consensual, but that argument is usually defeated because the failure to disclose the sexual disease is considered to be a form of fraud. Now let's move to the other kind of consent where I think there's a little bit more to say, and that's implied consent. There are two different kinds of implied consent. The first kind of implied consent is consent that is implied by custom and usage. Implied consent from custom and usage. If a plaintiff goes to a place or engages in an activity where certain invasions are routine, then it is assumed that the plaintiff is amenable, is agreeable to those invasions. The classic example is when you play sports. I'm talking about team sports. I'm talking about contact sports. If you play football, American football, and you get knocked down by another player, that is not a battery. At least it's not an actionable battery. Why not? Because you consented to being knocked down. When did you consent to being knocked down? Well, when you agreed to play the game, because it is a customary part of the play of the game that you will get knocked down. If you play basketball and you get shoved by another player while you're on the hardwood court, same analysis. You consent to that. That's part of the routine play of basketball. My favorite sport example would have to be from ice hockey. You're playing ice hockey. You get called for a penalty. You go in the penalty box. You're all like, false imprisonment. No, you agreed to that. That 2-minute confinement is something that you consented to. It's part of the play of ice hockey. Now, that said, there are many, many other situations where we have implied consent by custom and usage. Whenever you get on a crowded subway at rush hour, you consent to the pushes and shoves that are incident to being on a crowded subway at rush hour. We could multiply the examples endlessly. A very important concept of implied consent is in the property torts area. When you have a house, if you have a front walk, you give implied consent to people to walk up the front walk and knock on your door. That is by custom of the community. It is considered customarily acceptable if somebody wants to talk to you that they can come up your front walk and do that. It is implied consent to enter a supermarket when the door is unlocked and they're open for business. That's why you're not a trespasser when you go buy groceries. Implied consent is everywhere. Now, there is a second species of implied consent. The label I'm going to give it is a bit wordy, so let me apologize for that, but there can be implied consent based on a defendant's reasonable interpretation of the plaintiff's objective conduct. Defendant's reasonable interpretation of the plaintiff's objective conduct. My short form label for this is body language consent. Body language consent. In effect, what the law says is in one-on-one interactions, you are allowed to read the situation. You are allowed to rely on how the other person is behaving and was behaving in the past several minutes. You are allowed to look at the surrounding circumstances and to draw reasonable inferences and then act accordingly. I want you to imagine that two people have been out for a date. I want you to imagine this is maybe the second or third time they've been out together. And one says to the other at the conclusion of the meal, would you like to come up to my place for an after-dinner drink? And the other person says, yes, that sounds lovely. So they go upstairs, and the apartment owner puts some soft music on the stereo, lights a few candles, and then goes to a liquor cabinet. Some alcohol is poured, and they adjourn to the sofa with their snifters of Courvoisier to continue their conversation. During the course of the conversation, however, there is a lull in the conversation. There's a moment at which they both run out of things to say, the inevitable awkward pause. And at that moment, one of the two closes their eyes, and inclines their head thusly, at which point the other person leans forward and plants a kiss on the lips. No sooner is that accomplished than the first person reaches into a pocket and withdraws a previously drafted complaint. Battery. The lawsuit begins, okay? Now, in that scenario, the person being sued is going to argue consent. The argument is going to be that I made a reasonable interpretation from objective conduct. I don't know what's going on inside your head, but the objective conduct, we'd seen each other previously. We had just had a pleasant evening. We were enjoying a drink on the sofa. You closed your eyes, you inclined your head. All of this would be pointed to as a basis for reasonableness. Now, let me make a serious comment about this scenario. I am not suggesting, by any shred of the imagination, that in this kind of a scenario where you invite someone up for a drink and you're enjoying a quiet evening together on the sofa, that there is consent to sexual intercourse. Without a considerably greater amount of behavior that indicated that sexual intercourse was acceptable, if you engage in sexual intercourse, in the facts of the hypo I just used, that's date rape. That is not reasonable. Now, at the end of the day, in our system, juries are the arbiters of reasonableness. If you think in my kissing hypothetical that it was unreasonable and you were on the jury, you would cast your verdict accordingly. There are some people who say that it is unreasonable absent an express declaration of consent. I would think that at least some juries would view my hypothetical as making out a case of implied consent. In most situations of romantic encounter, it is not usually the case that the parties are exchanging constant questions and answers over consent. It is more a reading of the situation. But remember, it always has to be reasonable. Okay, so that is the other kind of implied consent, and that kind of implied consent can come up certainly in a non-consensual situation as well. When you go to the doctor, it is not always the case that the doctor explicitly says, I'm going to touch X part of the body. Are you okay with that? But the interaction makes it plain that the doctor means to do that. And so that is an implied consent. That's why doctors don't get sued unless they behave in inappropriate ways. Okay? Now, there is a final caveat to the entire body of consent material, and it is this. All consent has a scope. If a defendant exceeds the scope of consent, the defendant should be held liable. All consent has a scope. Consent is not all or nothing. It's not on or off, yes or no, sky's the limit. I'll use an electrical metaphor. It's not like a light switch, it's like a dimmer, all right? And if you turn it up only halfway, then that's only consent to do what you consented to. There are a number of examples that I could give you about this. Let's go back to sports. When you play sports, there's an implied consent. You play basketball, there's an implied consent to getting shoved because being shoved is part of basketball. But if during the course of the game you lose your footing and you're down on the hardwood and another player stomps on your hand, that's a battery because that exceeds the scope of consent. Whatever the physical interactions may be in basketball, stomping on someone's hand is not part of the game. Another example of exceeding scope of consent is in the medical context. If you give express consent to a doctor to operate on one part of your body, and the doctor operates on a different and remote part of your body, that's going to be a battery. It exceeds the scope of consent. You go into the hospital. You need surgery on your knee. You heard it, playing sports. Doctor operates. You're in the recovery room, and the surgeon comes in. You're just recovering from the anesthesia. You're still groggy. You see the doctor, you're like, so how did it go? And the doctor's all smiles. He says, it went great. You're going to be as good as new. And then he says, still smiling, he says, and I got some more good news for you. Because while I had you in that operating room under general anesthesia, I also gave you a nose job. Because I got to tell you, that was one rude looking honker you had on your face. This was the moment to fix it. All right. That's a battery. Bad doctor. Don't do that. Okay? Scope of consent. So that's topic number one in the area of affirmative defenses. Topic number two is the protective privileges. The protective privileges. There are three protective privileges that I want you to be aware of, but their analysis is identical. So you just need to know the names, but there's only one analytic structure for all three. The protective privileges are self-defense, defense of others, and defense of property. Self-defense, defense of others, and defense of property. All three of these involve a defendant responding to a threat that is emanating or radiating or coming from the plaintiff. There's some kind of threat coming from the plaintiff. The plaintiff is perhaps threatening the defendant's physical safety, or perhaps the plaintiff is threatening the physical safety of a third person, or perhaps the plaintiff is threatening the defendant's stuff, and the defendant wants to take proactive action in order to mitigate or prevent this threat. Two key things you have to think about in determining whether or not a protective privilege is available. The first is a question of timing. A protective privilege is only available if the threat is in progress or imminent. The threat has to be in progress or imminent. It has to be happening right now, or it's about to happen in the next few seconds. In other words, you only have protective privileges if you're acting in the heat of the moment, if you're acting in real time. There are two negative consequences that flow from that, two scenarios that they can give you where the protective privilege won't be available. And those are obviously acting too soon and acting too late. Acting too soon. Somebody comes up to you, perhaps they raise their hand and they say, tomorrow, I'm going to slap you silly. That's an assault, right? But in response to this, tomorrow I'm going to slap you silly, you say, oh yeah, and you punch him in the face. Is that self-defense? Does that feel like self-defense? No, you're all nodding no. It's not self-defense. It's too soon. You're not acting in the heat of the moment. The person said they were going to slap you tomorrow, so you can't use force today. No preemption. Let's boil it down to that. No preemption. You can't take a preventative measure like that. What about too late? Somebody comes up to you and they punch you in the face. Unprovoked, just a complete surprise out of the blue. They punch you in the face and they turn around and they walk away. They get a half a block down the street, and now, suddenly realizing how outrageous this is, you run after them, knock them to the pavement, and start banging their head against the sidewalk. Self-defense? No. Does it feel like self-defense? No, you're acting too late. Let's call this principle no revenge. If it's over, it's over, and you're not allowed to then resort to self-help to force, okay? Now, in all of this, don't forget common sense. If it's over, it's over, but you have to use common sense in deciding if it's over. You get into a heated argument with somebody. Oh, it's a stupid argument. It's about who got to a parking space first, and it's escalating, and the other person is getting so angry at you that they haul off and they belt you. They punch you in the face. But no sooner do they punch you in the face than they go, over. And you're like, darn it, now I can't hit them back. Then they hit you a second time and they go, over. And you're like, well, I can't get one in here. This is really annoying me. That's absurd. Obviously, if they're standing their ground, it's not over. It's not over until they disengage, until they walk away from the conflict. So be sensible about it. And obviously, you'll have a chance to work lots of practice questions and hone your common sense as you get deeper into your prep. Okay, so that's the first requirement. The second requirement is a requirement that I call a requirement of accuracy. And that requirement is that the defendant must have a reasonable belief that the threat is genuine. It has to be a reasonable belief that the threat is genuine. Now, that's a very interesting statement. It's worded as if it's a requirement, but it's actually kind of a sort of a latitude for the defendant, right? Because what it means is that the defendant will not be liable if the defendant makes a reasonable mistake. If the defendant makes a reasonable mistake, the defendant still has the defense available. Reasonable mistake will not destroy the defense. Let me do one with defensive property. We haven't done one with defensive property. I want you to assume that you're returning from a business trip, and it was a very long business trip. You're a litigation associate, and you were sent out of town to review documents, and you had to go for a long time. And let me tell you something about being sent out of town to review documents. I can tell you this from firsthand experience. Documents are never in a good place. I don't know why, but they just don't keep documents. There are no documents in the state of Hawaii. All right. All documents are in a warehouse in Amarillo. And so you were sent to Amarillo and you were there for 3 weeks. And therefore, you know what you had to do? You had to pack a suitcase that was too big to carry on. And you know what that means? Now you're back home. You have to wait to get your bag off the baggage carousel. So there you are. You're waiting. And you've cleverly put a rainbow colored ribbon around your suitcase so that you can recognize it. In any event, you're there. You're waiting. You're bored, but you're anxious. You're anxious, but you're bored. Finally, you see a bag, rainbow-colored ribbon. You try to make your way towards your bag. You can hardly get there. It's like the fall of Saigon. It's such a crowd by the baggage carousel. But as you're getting closer, someone else picks up your bag, and they begin walking out of the terminal briskly. So you run after them, and you grab the bag out of their hand. You say, hey, give me that. And they look at you like you're crazy, and they say, buddy, what's your problem? Check the name tag. And you look and you realize, not your bag. It's this other person's bag. Apparently, he had the same clever idea with the rainbow-colored ribbon. So you apologize and you back off, but he sues you. He sues you for a battery because he was holding the bag when you grabbed it, and that's part of his person, and you touched it in a very brusque and offensive way, so he sues you for a battery. You argue in return, defense of property. He says, but it wasn't your property. And you say, I know I made a mistake, but I had a reasonable belief that it was my property. You will likely prevail. Your argument for invoking the defense is a good argument. That was a reasonable mistake. And so that's how that generally works. And now a final caveat on the protective privileges. Just as consent has a scope, in the area of protective privileges, you must limit your response to the force necessary under the circumstances. If you use excessive force, you go back to a posture of liability. You are allowed to fight fire with fire, but you can't fight fire with a nuclear weapon, okay? It's a rule of symmetry, of proportionality, a rule of necessity. Somebody's getting ready to slap you in the face. What are you allowed to do? Well, you can grab their arm to intercept the slap, even though grabbing an arm would be a battery. But you can do that, or you can shove them away, or you can slap them first. Yeah, I don't think so. And you can get in there quick, right? What are you not allowed to do? You're not allowed to reach into your jacket and take out a knife and start stabbing them. That would be an overreaction. That's not self-defense, right? Now, this rule of proportionality does mean that in a situation involving a deadly threat, you may resort to deadly force. If you can fight fire with fire, if someone's coming at you with a gun and you are also armed, you can take out your weapon and fire first. Deadly force is appropriate, and that is also true if you are intervening to protect a third person from harm. However, deadly force is always disproportionate, excessive, and impermissible if all you're doing is protecting property. You can't shoot trespassers unless there are other circumstances. You can't use a gun to protect your laptop. It's a rule of proportionality. And you may remember this rule because almost everybody reads the same case in first year of law school. It's a very famous case from the Iowa Supreme Court from the 1970s. The name of the case is Katko v. Briney, and it involved a spring gun, a shotgun trap that these farmers set up in a shed because they were being harassed by people who were trespassing into their shed, and so they couldn't stand it anymore. They did the shotgun trap. The burglar goes in there, triggers the shotgun trap, gets injured, sues the farmers. Farmers said defense of property, and the court said, no, you can't defend your property with that gun. Okay? So with that in mind, let's do one more practice question before I give those of you with me here in the room another chance to stretch your legs. Here's my fact pattern. I have a homeowner. Her name is Darlene. You'll notice the D name. Darlene has become very worried about a series of burglaries in her neighborhood, and so she recently purchased a gun for protection. One evening shortly thereafter, a homeless individual, I will call this person Pat, gender neutral, Pat was trying to get out of the cold and entered Darlene's garage. There was a door. She had kept it unlocked, and it was not the main door that the car went in, but a side door, and so Pat goes in to the garage. Darlene hears noises coming from the garage because Pat was rummaging around trying to find some blankets to keep warm. So Darlene, the homeowner, opens the door to the garage holding her gun, pointing the gun at Pat in an attempt to frighten Pat. Darlene shouts, "Get out or I'll shoot," and then fires what she means to be a warning shot into the ceiling. "Get out or I'll shoot," and fires at the ceiling. But unfortunately, her aim was a little bit off, and the bullet ricochets and hits the homeless person in the shoulder. The homeless person, Pat, sues Darlene for battery. What's her best defense? What do you think her best defense is? I'll give you choices. A, Pat was a trespasser. B, she used reasonable force to protect her property. C, she didn't intend to hit him. Or D, she reasonably feared for her life. Okay? So mull that. I'll give you the choices one more time. Just write a letter down. I want, I'm looking, I'm watching, I can see you. Write it down. A, he was a trespasser. He, she, Pat was a trespasser. B, Darlene used reasonable force to protect her property. C, she didn't intend to hit anyone. Or D, she reasonably feared for her life. I think the best answer is D. She reasonably feared for her life. The fact that somebody is a trespasser does not give you a right to shoot them. I literally said that like 4 minutes ago. And the fact that she was protecting property means that she explicitly was not using reasonable force if she used a gun. So B doesn't make any sense. Not only that, whether or not she intended to shoot or hit him doesn't matter because she did intend to scare him. So under transferred intent, she can't rely on the argument, well, I didn't intend this. So the best argument is that she feared for her life. Now, the reason I wanted you to think about this problem is because although generally you can't use deadly force to protect property. When someone trespasses in your home, most courts say that that is not just protecting property. The minute a stranger comes in your home, you may make an inference that there is also a risk to your physical safety. And in this day and age, you may make the further assumption that they may be armed, and therefore most courts will allow deadly force to protect someone who's invaded your home. Okay, so as promised, for those in the room, I do want to give a break so that you can stretch legs, and we will come back and we will do one more affirmative defense and then talk about negligence for the rest of our time today.
This marks the beginning of a 10-minute break. The 10-minute break is ending.
So we have one final topic in the intentional torts material to cover, and that topic is the topic of necessity. The necessity defenses only apply to the three property torts. So the underlying claim has to be trespass to land, conversion, or trespass to chattel. If it's not one of those three claims, don't even think about this. Let me also mention, just for what it's worth, that in the real world, the necessity defenses come up infrequently, but they are guaranteed to make an appearance on the bar, so here's what you need to know. There are two different defenses. They have different definitional condition and different legal consequences. The first one is called public necessity. In a public necessity scenario, the defendant commits a property tort in an emergency to protect the community as a whole or a significant group of people. Protect the community as a whole or a significant group of people. When that is true, it is a complete and absolute defense. If that condition is met, no liability for anything. Now, I want to make sure you're with me on this. I want to give you some context or some atmospherics here. The emergency that typically triggers public necessity is usually a pretty big catastrophe. It is usually some kind of public emergency, and it's usually threatening very significant harm. A classic example is a fire that is spreading throughout a city. Imagine a windy day. Imagine a neighborhood that primarily consists of wooden structures. The fire is being fanned by the winds, and it is communicated from one building to the next. Not only that, let's make it more dramatic. The fire is bearing down on a local gasoline refinery. If the fire gets to the gasoline refinery, there'll be a horrific explosion, great loss of life. So that's going to be the background setup. It's going to be some big catastrophe like that, a hurricane, something like that. And into this scenario will come an individual who wants to mitigate the harm, an individual who wants to deal with the crisis, an individual who is a hero, and not just a hero, but entirely selfless, doing this just to be a public, good-spirited person. I refer to this person as the savior of the city. He's the savior of the city. But in order to accomplish the heroic purpose, he needs to go on somebody else's property, or he needs to take and use somebody else's stuff. So in my scenario of the fire burning from building to building and bearing down on the gas refinery, now comes Dave. Dave is the only person out and about because it's otherwise a quiet Sunday morning. He looks around and he sees that the situation is quite dire. He also looks around and he notices across the street, not in the path of the fire, is a building with a big sign above it that says Acme Fire Extinguisher Company. So he runs over there, but he discovers that the building is locked. It's a Sunday and there's nobody inside. So he smashes a window and then he climbs in and he takes as many fire extinguishers as he can carry, and he works the fire and he puts out the fire. And for his trouble, the Acme Fire Extinguisher sues Dave for two torts: trespass to land, breaking the window and going in the property, and conversion, because he took and used up all those fire extinguishers. In that case, Dave has no liability. That's a public necessity case. Contrast private necessity. In private necessity, the defendant commits a property tort in an emergency, but does so for personal reasons, does so to protect an interest of his own. Not public-spirited, but self-interested. The catastrophe threatens only his own safety or his possessions. And so he takes something that belongs to somebody else, or he enters somebody else's land in order to protect his stuff or his bodily security. This is only a partial defense. To be more specific, there are three legal consequences in a private necessity scenario. They're interconnected, I'm going to give them to you as abstractions, and then I'll double back and make them concrete with example. The first legal consequence in a private necessity scenario is that you have to pay for any actual harm you do. Any harm you do to the plaintiff's property, you have to pay for that. Now, obviously, paying for harm, we have a fancy legal word for that. That's called compensatory damages. So you remain liable for compensatory damages in a private necessity scenario. Second legal consequence. If you do no harm, your technical tort is excused. Your technical tort is excused, and therefore you will not be held liable for nominal or punitive damages. No harm, then no tort, then no nominal or punitive. Third legal consequence. If you go on someone's property during the emergency to take refuge, you must be allowed to remain. The property owner is not allowed to throw you off the land as long as the emergency continues. Normally, you can eject a trespasser. You can throw a trespasser off your land. If you come home and somebody's having a picnic on your front lawn, you can be like, what the hell, what are you doing? And you can literally drag them off your land, but not in an emergency. In an emergency, somebody has a permission or a privilege to enter, and you have to tolerate their presence as long as the emergency persists. I sometimes refer to this as a right of sanctuary. I don't know, it's a very medieval concept, but it's like from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, if you've ever seen the classic movie where the lead character Quasimodo runs into the cathedral and he goes sanctuary. So it's that kind of an idea. Promised you hypos? Here's the hypos. I'm going to take one story with 3 different endings. Here's my story. Dave is a cross-country hiker. Dave is a cross-country hiker, and where is he hiking? He's hiking in rural northern Minnesota. And when is he doing this? He's doing this in the month of February. In other words, Dave is an idiot because he's hiking through the coldest state in the country in the coldest month of the year, but he loves cold weather hiking and camping. In any event, as he's hiking, a sudden unexpected blizzard arises, and it is absolutely fierce. In a matter of minutes, the temperature drops by 20 degrees. It was already frigid. Now it is absolutely intolerable. Snow begins coming down, and it is almost whiteout conditions. The wind is now howling at something like 40 or more miles an hour. And Dave realizes if he doesn't take shelter, he's going to die. He looks around, he scans the horizon, literally only one structure visible anywhere that he can see, and that would be a lone farmhouse owned by Farmer Pete. So, making his way through wind and snow, Dave achieves the farmhouse. And now I can give you the 3 endings to the story. Number 1, he bangs on the door of the farmhouse, and there is no answer. He goes around to the side, and he looks in the window, and it's completely dark. Obviously, Farmer Pete is not home. So, with the storm getting worse, he breaks the window, and he climbs in, and he takes refuge inside the farmhouse overnight. When the storm lets up in the morning, he goes on his way, but Farmer Pete has security cameras. And when he sees the broken window, he screens the footage, and he finds hiker Dave, and Farmer Pete sues hiker Dave for trespass to land, and he says, pay me for the window. What result? Farmer will win. The farmer will win and recover the money for the window because this was only a private necessity. There was no public interest involved, and in a private necessity, you must pay for the harm that you do. In effect, the judge is going to say, look, I don't fault you for breaking the window and taking refuge. I would have done the same thing. But there's no reason for the farmer to get stuck with the bill. Pay the man for the window. You're the one who made the judgment that your life was worth more than the window. You should pay for the window. Second version of the ending of the story. Dave arrives at the farmhouse, bangs on the door. There's no answer, but this time he thinks to try the door. and it's unlocked. Of course it's unlocked. Why the hell would you lock your door? You live in the middle of nowhere. So he walks in and he takes refuge overnight, spends the night, but he doesn't touch anything. He doesn't break anything. He doesn't even go in the fridge and take food or beverage, and then he leaves. Farmer reviews security footage, sees this, sues him. Farmer Pete versus hiker Dave sues him for trespass. It's a technical trespass, but he says, I want $1. Nominal damages. It's the principle of the thing, says Farmer Pete. Farmer Pete will lose that case. No technical trespass. In an emergency, you have a privilege to enter. If you have a privilege to enter, it's not a trespass. You can't recover $1 from someone who has a privilege. And if the farmer says, forget the $1, I want $5,000 punitive damages, teach him a lesson, deterrence, so he never does it again, you can't get that either. Because without a technical tort, there's no basis for punitive damages. Third and final ending to the story. He arrives, bangs on the door, no answer, tries the door, unlocked. He goes in to take refuge. But 10 minutes after he arrives, who comes down the stairs from the upper level? It's Farmer Pete. He'd been having a nap, and between the howling of the wind, he didn't hear the banging on the front door. But now he sees someone in his house, and he says, who are you? And Dave says, I'm Dave, the hiker from the hypo. And Pete says, well, get the hell out of my house. Shoves him out the front door, pulls the door closed, and locks it. If Dave, having been thrown out of the house, sustains any injuries out in the blizzard, if he gets frostbite, if he gets pneumonia, if he dies of exposure out there, the farmer will be liable. You normally have a privilege to eject a trespasser, but not in the middle of a blizzard. You have to tolerate their presence. I like telling my New York friends this. It usually upsets them. It's like they're incredulous. They're like, I got to let him stay? It's like, yes, you've got to let him stay. It would be inhumane to throw him out in the storm, right? And so that's how the necessity doctrine. And that actually does conclude our conversation about intentional torts. If you're sort of tracking Barbary modules, that is the end of our first very large module. Our next topic is going to be to turn our attention to the law of negligence. Negligence is, of course, the biggest topic in the law of torts. Most first-year teachers spend a ton of time on it. On the multi-state exam, 50% of the short answer questions will be about negligence. So of the 27 or so questions, you should expect to see about 14 negligence questions. You should see probably about 7 or 8 intentional tort questions, and really only 4 or 5 scattered questions on all the other topics. So this is the big elephant in the room, if you want to put it that way. Let's begin with a list of elements. Everybody knows the elements, but I want to do this for the sake of thoroughness. There are 4 elements for the tort of negligence. Element number 1 is duty. The plaintiff must show that the defendant owed a duty and then specify the nature of that duty. Element number 2, breach. The plaintiff has to show that the defendant failed to live up to the duty of care and must do that in a very specific way. Very concrete, very specific evidentiary showing. Number 3, causation. As we will see further down the road, causation comes in 2 flavors. There is factual cause, there's proximate cause. We could have listed them as separate elements. There would be nothing wrong with listing them as separate elements, but then we would have 5 and you'd be all freaked out. So I kept it as 4. All right? And then the final element is damage. You have to show that something bad happened to you. Now, the way that we have divided this, the way that we have kind of structured this, because negligence as itself would be too big of a chunk, is that we're treating the duty breach materials as one kind of component or module, and then the causation damage material along with affirmative defenses as a second module. The duty breach material probably the biggest chunk, it combined with the intentional torts, rivaling for first place in terms of time and depth of material. Okay, so I want to talk with you about the duty element. We are not going to get past the duty element today. We are not going to finish the duty element today. So for those of you with me physically here in the room, that is something to bear in mind. Whereas if you're following at home, you can just take the material at whatever divisions suit your needs. Before I launch into a discussion of the duty element, I just want to sort of remind you of what the whole point of negligence law is, because I think it makes the following conversation much more sensible. It is an inescapable reality of life in the modern world that when you go out in the world and do things, when you engage in activities, there is a chance that you could hurt someone else. And there is literally no way to get that chance down to a mathematical zero. The only way to get the chance of hurting other people down to zero would be to not act, to lie at home inert in your bed, which on some days is an appealing option, but it is not the way to have a productive society. So the legal system does not ask you to eliminate all possibility of injuring other people, because that's impossible. What the legal system asks you to do instead is to take some effort to reduce the chances that you may injure other people. As you move from activity to different activity, we expect you to exert some effort to lower the amount of risk you impose on the other people who you share the world with. When I say the word duty, that's what I'm referring to. It's your obligation to take risk-reducing precautions as you engage in different activities. All activities have risk, but the risk moves up or down depending on how you conduct them. You're not allowed to conduct activities pursuant to your unfettered whims. You might derive a lot of joy from driving your car at 90 miles an hour through residential suburban neighborhoods with your feet while blindfolded. But the law says you must take risk-reducing precautions. You must drive at a slower rate of speed, use your hands, and take the blindfold off, because that would be less likely to injure other people. So that's what I mean when I say the word duty. And when I define duty as the obligation to take risk-reducing precautions to avoid injuring others, that to me suggests two questions, which are the questions I want to pursue. The first question is, okay, you said take precautions to avoid injuring others. Which others? Who are the people that I'm supposed to think about as I engage in my preventative and risk-reducing measures? Who are the people who should be in my mind? Who are the beneficiaries of my effort? Who are the objects of my solicitude as I engage in this risk reduction enterprise? Now, the standard answer that you would find in a torts text is that you owe a duty of care to foreseeable victims. Foreseeable victims, I did air quotes if you're looking away from me, and that two-word phrase is definitely accurate as far as it goes, but I fear that it doesn't communicate valuable exam-related material. So let's manipulate it, let's massage it. If you owe a duty to foreseeable victims, that means that you do not owe a duty to unforeseeable victims. That's just turning an affirmative statement into a double negative. Any affirmative remains true if you make it a double negative, so you don't owe a duty to unforeseeable victims. What does that mean? It means unforeseeable victims always lose negligence lawsuits on the bar exam. An unforeseeable victim always loses because an unforeseeable victim is not owed a duty, because only foreseeable victims are owed duties. That sounds a little bit more pointedly helpful to me in terms of dealing with questions. Unforeseeable victim always loses, but you have to know what an unforeseeable victim looks like. So let's see if we can identify an unforeseeable victim. I'll start with a generic, or not generic, I'll start with a specific case and try to move to a generic definition, okay? Here's my example. Two guys are rushing to catch a train. But when they arrive on the platform, they notice the train they would like to board is about to pull out of a station. There's a little platform in the back of the train, and they think that despite the fact that the train is moving, they can still jump onto that platform. And there's a railroad employee standing right nearby who decides to give them some assistance by giving them a little push or boost onto the train. But the railroad employee, in the course of giving them that little push or boost, carelessly knocks a package out of the hands of one of the men. Does this sound at all familiar? Good. I'm getting lots of nods for those of you who are watching at home and can't see. People are smiling in recognition. I'm trying to describe the facts of Palsgraf versus the Long Island Railroad, sometimes labeled the most famous torts case ever decided. Just in case you never read it, I mean, first of all, yeah, like what was that about? How did you miss it? But if you never read it, the package that was knocked out of the guy's hands falls to the ground, and it's filled with powerful fireworks, creates an enormous explosion in the train station, knocks down some weighing scales, some penny weighing scales that were on the platform, and they, in turn, fall on this lady, Helen Palsgraf, causing her injury. Helen Palsgraf. She's like the world's only unforeseeable victim. What's up with her? Let me see if I can tell you how I think about the case. As you may have gathered by now, I'm pretty immature. I have a pretty childish view of this material. I find that that helps me. So here's how I think about the Palsgraf case. I imagine that I could go back in time and stop the action. I could stop the action with my magic stopwatch, and now I'm going to interview this employee of the Long Island Railroad. Now, my interview is going to be very short, one question. I'm just going to say to him, you're about to do something careless. You're going to knock this package out of this man. You're going to shove this man. I got a quick question for you. Excuse me. Who do you think might get hurt? And I can hear him talking in response, like I said, from New York. I know how they talk on Long Island. So I'd say, who do you think might get hurt? He'd look at me and he'd say, well, I'm shoving a man on a moving train. If I shove him hard, he could fall and he could bang his head. So the guy I'm shoving, he could get hurt. I'd say, good. Who else do you think might get hurt? And he'd say to me, well, the train is kind of crowded. There's some other people standing there on that there platform, and if I shove him hard, he could fall against those other people, and that could produce like a domino effect. So they could get hurt too. Say, good. Who else could get hurt? He'd say, oh, gee, I don't know. He's holding that there package. I don't know what's in there, but it could be heavy, and he could drop it, and it could fall, well, it could fall on my foot. So, ironically, I myself could get hurt. I'd say, good. Who else could get hurt? He'd say, that's it. The guy I'm shoving, the people standing next to him, and maybe me. And I'd say to him, well, what about the lady standing way the hell over there? He'd say, what lady? I'd say, the one by the scales. And he'd say, no way. There's nothing I'm doing over here that could cause her to get hurt over there. Okay? Now, this case goes all the way up to the highest court in New York State. It goes up to the highest court in New York State, the New York Court of Appeals, and the majority opinion is written by Benjamin Cardozo. Benjamin Cardozo, at that time, a judge on the New York Court of Appeals, subsequently a Supreme Court justice, and then a law school. Cardozo decided on a 4-3 vote that Helen Palsgraf was not owed a duty of care because she was an unforeseeable victim because, in his phrase, she was outside the zone of danger. She was outside the zone of danger. And Cardozo's phrase lives on 90 years after he coined it, and it is a perfectly good phrase to sprinkle into an essay. But the truth of the matter is, I don't think you really need it. You want to know why Helen Palsgraf lost her case? I'll tell you why she lost her case. It's very simple. She was very far away. She was way the hell over there. If you act like a careless idiot over here, who are the people who are likely to get hurt? The answer is the people near you. When somebody far away gets hurt, your reaction is, how the hell did that happen? And you don't have to pay for it. Okay? Foreseeable victims are people who are near you. Unforeseeable victims are people who are far away. So now we have hammered this down into something that is pretty usable on the test. If you get a fact pattern and the person who got hurt started out very far away, if they were way the hell over there, if they began the problem in left field, they're probably going to lose. Why? Because they're outside the zone of danger, and therefore they're an unforeseeable victim, and therefore they're not owed a duty of care, and without a duty of care, they can't win. That's what it boils down to. And that's a pretty easy proposition. Now, let me make sure that you are with me on this. Near and far will vary depending on the activity. If you are walking down the street, then for the purposes of a zone of danger, the zone of danger may be a circle only 10 feet in circumference or 10 feet in diameter surrounding you as you move down the street. But if you're driving your car, the zone of danger may be considerably bigger. It might be 100 yards. Because if you get into a car collision, not only might you hurt people in another vehicle, but a piece of metal might go flying, or a piece of glass might go flying, and you might hurt someone on the adjacent sidewalk. If you're chopping down a tree, then the zone of danger has to be at least the height of the tree. And if you're juggling nuclear weapons, then the zone of danger is the whole city, right? So near and far are not self-executing concepts. They require you to use your head, to engage brain, to be commonsensical about it. But the zone of danger, when I mishandle a person and knock his package down, is not way the hell over there. Now, one of the things you will discover when you go deep dive into the duty rules and the law of negligence is that almost every duty rule has a companion exception. When you study these, I want you to study them as rule exception, rule exception. It's like peanut butter and jelly, bacon and eggs. The exception to the pause graph principle is rescuers. A rescuer is given a free pass with regard to the pause graph doctrine. A rescuer may begin the fact pattern way the hell over there and only come to the center of the action to give aid and comfort and assistance to somebody who's more directly injured. If the rescuer in the process sustains injuries, the rescuer will be allowed to go forward with a negligence case. They are not barred. They are not subject to the zone of duty principle. Ironically, it was that very same judge, Benjamin Cardozo, who stated that principle in another very well-known New York opinion, a case called Wagner. In that opinion, he coined the phrase, danger invites rescue. What he essentially meant is that after the initial accident, people are drawn in. It's actually a very optimistic statement by Cardozo. It's a statement about people's good nature. What he's saying, danger invites rescue, what he's saying is that people are decent and they will come and give help. So you should expect it. So we're going to treat those folks as foreseeable, even if they started way the hell over there. So how did we get into this conversation? I said that duty is an obligation to take risk-reducing precautions for the benefit of others. And I said, first question, which others? And now you know. Second question, how much precaution? How many precautions? Now I know who I should be thinking about, but how hard do I have to work at this effort? We come in this area of negligence law to the single best known legal doctrine in all of your bar study. I know that's a bit self-important. There may be other doctrines from other courses that could nominate, but I pick this one. The rule is that you must exercise the same degree of precaution as would have been exercised by a hypothetical, reasonably prudent person acting under similar circumstances. A hypothetical, reasonably prudent person acting under similar circumstances. Now, I want to explore that principle with you in greater depth. But before we do, let us pause and see if we can take a little bit of a practice question. Let me put you to work, if you want to put it that way. Let me get you to kind of get out of the note-taking mode, and I'll give you a fact pattern. My defendant in this case is going to be a corporation. I'll call it the Deluxe Corporation. And the Deluxe Corporation owns, operates, and manages an apartment building in an upscale and generally safe neighborhood of a large city. There is a garage that is part of this apartment building where tenants can park their cars, and there is a door that leads from the garage out to the street. The door is designed only to be opened from the inside so that you can exit out to the street, but it is not supposed to be opened from the street so that people on the street can enter the garage. Nonetheless, Deluxe Corporation has carelessly failed to keep the door in good repair. The door has now become in disrepair, and it can be opened from the street side. One evening, Patricia is walking down the street right in front of the apartment building. She does not live in the building, but it is on the way between her place of work and her home. As she walks past the building, she is accosted, she is confronted by a mugger. The mugger, who does not want to be seen in public committing his evil deeds, looks around for a place where he might complete his crime in private. He notices this door, he tries it, and he is able to open it and enter the deluxe apartment garage because it was not in good repair. Once inside the garage, the mugger commits an attack. He assaults Patricia and takes her purse and then runs away. Patricia files a negligence claim against the deluxe apartment building, and she claims that she sustained damages due to their negligence. In that claim, is she likely to win or lose? Is she likely to win? Yes or no? And why or why not? Okay, so write it down, yes or no, and then write down one sentence or even just a few key words, micro essay style. My view on this is that Patricia should lose. My view is that Patricia is an unforeseeable victim and she's not owed a duty of care. The persons who are most likely to be affected by this, the foreseeable victims, are the residents of the apartment building. The residents of the apartment building are the ones who might sustain criminal attacks when people enter the building and once in the building could do things to them, either as they're using the garage or these evildoers could then go upstairs. But passersby on the street, probably not foreseeable victims. They are not the people to whom we would say that the apartment building owes a duty, and consequently, I think, no recovery here. So we were talking about the reasonably prudent person standard of care, and on the reasonably prudent person standard of care, obviously, we all know, I trust, that this is a kind of a very subjective, very sort of loosey-goosey legal standard. There is, however, one thing that you will see on the multiple choice exam almost every time they test on it. And let me kind of get you thinking about this in the following way. All standards of care are basically a yardstick of comparison. Basically, we look at the defendant and the defendant's behavior, and we're looking at a yardstick. When we talk about a standard of care, that's what we mean. A metric, a ruler, a measuring device. The defendant, look at the yardstick. So you have to know what the yardstick is. What do we know about the reasonably prudent person? Well, the first thing we know about the reasonably prudent person is that it has no physical attributes. The reasonably prudent person has no height, no weight, no age, no sex, no race, no physical attributes whatsoever. If I say close your eyes and visualize the reasonably prudent person, you should get a blank. There is no image, right? The best I can do is to imagine the illicit love child of the Michelin Man and the Pillsbury Doughboy, just a big blob, right? Other than that, there is no image. But the reasonably prudent person has a very specific set of behaviors. That's where the definitional element lies. And that can all be summed up with the following observation. The reasonably prudent person is somebody you would never, ever want to go drinking with, because the reasonably prudent person is human buzzkill, right? This is somebody who's very attentive, maybe a little bit too attentive to hang out with. This is somebody who's always alert, always careful, always taking advanced precautions. Reasonably prudent person is the kind of person who always puts flares and one of those silvery rescue blankets and those orange breakdown triangles in the trunk of the car, just in case. The reasonably prudent person is the kind of person who always locks the car doors whenever getting out of the car, just to even run into a convenience store to buy a beverage. The reasonably prudent person is the kind of person who always arranges to have somebody come in to water the plants and feed the pets when they go out of town for an extended period of time. Do you do that? Because if you do, I commend you. If you do it without fail regularly, I try to do it, but sometimes when I'm getting ready to go out of town, I'm a mess. I'm still packing. The Uber is already there. I'm in a state. I just run out. I go on the road. I come back after 10 days. Got a skeleton of a cat in the kitchen, right? And it's like, oh, Fluffy, you know, I was going to have to change your name now because you're not Fluffy anymore. The reasonably prudent person would never, ever spray lighter fluid on a lit barbecue, which to me is one of the great joys of barbecuing, to get that giant whoosh of flame before you finally put the burgers on and give them that added special chemical taste that makes them taste so good. The reasonably prudent person is just a pill. And the bottom line is that most of us don't live up to that standard most of the time. I mean, it's just, we just fall short of that standard consistently, and we just thank our lucky stars that we haven't killed or maimed anyone. I can't tell you how many times I pulled into the garage at GW, and I think to myself, whew, that was close, all right? So the reasonably prudent person, that's our standard. That's the yardstick or the metric. And now we're going to compare the defendant to that metric. And here's your key point, guys. It's an objective standard of care, and therefore we make no allowances for the defendant's particular shortcomings. Everyone must live up to the standard. Everyone must live up to the standard. It is an objective standard. I get 100 people in a room. They all must adhere to that standard. And that makes it inflexible, rigid, and harsh. Pete sues Dave in a negligence claim, and here's the allegation. Pete claims that Dave kept gasoline-soaked rags in his unventilated garage during the hottest months of the summer, that those rags caught fire, and that the fire then burned Dave's own garage, and then the fire spread next door and burned Pete's garage as well. These are detached garages, so there was no damage to the houses, and there was no personal injury, but Pete sues Dave, seeking to recover money for the burned garage, and proves the facts that I just mentioned, and then rests. Dave gets up and says to the judge, Your Honor, I was hoping not to have to say this in open court, but the truth of the matter is, sir, I'm stupid. I don't mean this as a figure of speech. I mean it literally. I have a below normal IQ. My IQ is only 85. And I left school in the 10th grade because I was finding the work too difficult. And so there's lots of stuff I don't know. And you know what, Your Honor? It never occurred to me that rags could light on fire all by themselves. I'm still amazed that such a thing happened even as we stand here in court today. You know, Your Honor, the plaintiff keeps talking about spontaneous combustion. I never heard of spontaneous combustion. They must do that in the 11th grade. I'm doing the best I can here, so I'm not liable, am I? And the answer is, yeah, you are. Because you got to do as good as the reasonably prudent person, and you didn't. And so tough on you. Let's make it more extreme. What if I have a defendant who is developmentally disabled and has the mental age of a child, 7, 6, 5 years old? That person still has to do as good as the reasonably prudent person. Now, you might say to me, but that's unattainable. That you're asking that person to do the impossible. And I would say to you, yes, that is correct. That is one of the really unusual things about the reasonably prudent person standard of care. What if I have somebody who's mentally ill? They suffer from a disease of the mind. They think they're Napoleon. Too bad. They still have to do as good as the reasonably prudent person. You might say, but you're asking him to do the impossible. Yeah, I know. What if I have somebody who's an amateur, a beginner, a novice, engaged in an activity for the very first time? I got a 16-year-old kid, just got his driver's license. It's still warm from that plastic lamination process. How's he supposed to drive? Like a reasonably prudent person. I got a guy on rented skis. He's never been on a ski slope in his life. How's he supposed to ski? Like a reasonably prudent person. Everyone is held to this standard, and the standard sometimes demands from people the impossible. That's why I say it's objective. That's why I say it's harsh. That's why I say it's rigid. And now you know what you're going to see on the exam. You're going to see a bunch of people in the categories I just mentioned. You're going to see stupid people, and you're going to see clumsy people, and you're going to see inexperienced people. You're going to see novices and mentally ill people and developmentally disabled people. And there's going to be a choice. And it's going to say they are not liable because they were doing the best they could. They are not liable because they did the best they can. Don't ever pick that choice. The reasonably prudent person standard is an objective standard of care. Now, one of the reasons I like teaching torts is because it poses some of these interesting questions. And in my regular course at GW, I talk with my students about why a legal system would embrace a standard that asks certain people to do the impossible. This would be like a law that says you must flap your arms and fly to the West Coast. We can't imagine ever passing a law because such a thing is impossible. And yet that's what we're doing for certain people with the reasonably prudent person standard. This is not the time or place for that conversation. It's a good thing to think about when you're trapped in traffic, but for now, you have a good handle on what the examiners will ask about. Now, remember what I said about duty standards. They always come with exceptions. Peanut butter and jelly, bacon and eggs. Here are the exceptions to the reasonably prudent person standard of care. There are two of them. Number one, if a defendant has superior skill or knowledge, the standard of care includes that superior skill or knowledge. In other words, we look at a hypothetical reasonable person with that same superior skill or knowledge. Let's say we have actually, let me do this. I want to distinguish two situations for you on the superior skill and knowledge. Scenario number one is a defendant who has a body of knowledge. So I'm going to stipulate that I have a defendant who is a professional race car driver. Now, a professional race car driver has superior skill in the operation of motorized vehicles. How should a professional race car driver drive his or her automobile when going out to the grocery market to buy groceries? The answer is they should drive the car as carefully as a reasonably prudent motorist with the added skill of a race car driver. So let's say it's the winter. Let's say the roads are icy. And let's say they get into a skid. They are expected to use everything they know about controlling a car in a skid, because superior skill and knowledge becomes part of the standard. But there's another kind of superior skill or knowledge, and that is the possession of a single isolated nugget of fact. I want you to assume that I have a defendant who is not very bright. He's not very bright. He's a high school dropout, not very smart. Perfectly lovely person, but just not smart. But he's lived in the same neighborhood for 10 years, and he knows that the intersection down on his corner has limited visibility because of a heavy overgrowth of shrubs. How should he drive when he approaches the intersection? He should drive as a reasonably prudent person with the added knowledge that there is limited visibility at that corner. He should exercise some added caution at that corner because he has superior knowledge. If you were driving through the neighborhood for the first time, you would not have any advanced knowledge about that, and so we would not expect that of you. I mention that second example because it shows you that you can have a stupid person with superior knowledge. That's a bit counterintuitive, right? You say superior knowledge, that means a smarty pants. No, not necessarily. Could just be that you possess a particularly useful fact. In all of this, what I would tell you is that the reasonably prudent person standard of care is a one-way ratchet. If you're not familiar with the word, a ratchet is a type of wrench, often used in car repair, but it only turns in one direction. The reasonably prudent person standard of care can click higher. If I have my race car driver, if I have my guy who knows about the corner that is unusually dangerous, but it never clicks lower for the stupid or clumsy person. So I told you there are two exceptions. Exception number two. Exception number two is that where relevant, defendant's physical characteristics are taken into the standard of care. Where relevant, look at the physical characteristics. If the defendant is blind, the standard of care will be a reasonably prudent blind person. Now, on the one hand, that means that we do not expect a blind person to see things because a blind person does not have vision. On the other hand, we expect a reasonably prudent blind person to take precautions appropriate to their visual impairment. In other words, we expect them not to go out without a cane or a guide animal or some other assistive device. Now, bear in mind that physical characteristics are often not going to be relevant. Physical characteristics are not always relevant. Blind people should not keep gasoline-soaked rags in their unventilated garage. That has nothing to do with vision. And so don't think about physical characteristics unless there's something in the problem that suggests that they should be taken into account. Beyond that, I reiterate yet again, this is an objective standard of care. Not only is it an objective standard of care, it is a default standard of care. It applies in every case automatically by operation of law. It is there like the air in this room, unless it is displaced. Now, the next part of our conversation about duty is to talk about certain scenarios where we do displace the reasonably prudent standard of care and swap in an alternative standard of care. Some of these standards are stricter, some of these standards are more lenient. Sometimes the alternative standard is a zero duty. And there are 6 special duty scenarios. What I want to do is I want to take up 2 of these with those of you who are with me here today, and then I will release you for other pursuits. But all 6 of them are part of this module, and so depending on how you're working at home, you may want to listen to all 6 of them straight through. Okay? The first special duty standard is a special standard for negligence claims against children. Children under the age of 5 owe a 0 duty of care. Children under 5, 0 duty of care. It's not an important rule because they don't test on it much, because nobody really sues children under the age of 5. It just would be stupid. What are you going to sue an 18-month-old? That's crazy. Right? They're not negligent. They're cute. So anything, oh, look, you put the cat's tail in an electric socket. That's adorable, right? So we don't really think about that. Children over that magic age are subject to the following standard. They are supposed to behave as a child of similar age, experience, and intelligence acting under similar circumstances. Child is expected to behave like a hypothetical child of similar age, experience, and intelligence acting under similar circumstances. This standard is almost the exact opposite of the reasonably prudent person. On the printed page, it doesn't look that different, but trust me, it is a 180-degree flip. This is a subjective standard of care. If I have a room filled with 100 kids, every kid in the room is subject to a different standard of care. It is subjective. It varies from child to child. And that makes it very flexible, and that makes it very lenient. Bottom line, it's a pro-defendant standard of care. Let me show you why. I've got 2 kids playing outside their homes. I'll make them 6 years old. The first child is a little boy. I'll name him Billy, and Billy is riding a tricycle. He's riding his tricycle down to the corner and then back, down and back, down and back. Mommy said, don't go off the street. He's a good little boy. The other child is his next door neighbor. She too, a little girl, age 6. She's a child as well. She is sitting on the warm pavement in her cute little sundress playing jacks. She's bouncing a ball and picking up jacks. She's counting, she's concentrating. She's not paying much attention to Billy on his tricycle until Billy, in his tricycle, rides right over Susie's hand as it's down on the ground and breaks all the widow-bitty bones in her widow-bitty fingers. Susie is not pleased. So she sues Billy's widow-bitty ass because she wants to get some cash. And she takes the kid to court and she says, give me some money. Now, in that case, what is Billy's standard of care? How carefully is he obligated to operate his tricycle? Well, the standard that I gave you says first we look at a child of similar age. And I told you he's 6. If Billy had been 8, he would have been way more coordinated. He would have had a lot better reflexes. But he doesn't have to do as good as an 8-year-old. He's only 6. So we hold him to the standard of a 6-year-old. The standard also mentions experience. Age, experience. All right? Experience. I didn't tell you this, but Billy was a novice riding tricycles. He's kind of a late bloomer. He would never been on a tricycle. This was his maiden voyage. He was a tricycle virgin. All right? So that comes into the standard of care as well. And not only that, the standard also mentions intelligence. There's something else I forgot to tell you about Billy. He's stupid. His nickname on the street is Stupid Billy. His parents stay up late at night. They're worried about him. They're like, this kid is as dumb as rocks. What are we going to do? So let's recap. How carefully must Billy operate his tricycle? The answer is he must operate his tricycle as carefully as a stupid 6-year-old who's never been on a tricycle before. Susie only wins if he did worse than that. Well, as you can see, that's a tough push for her. Bottom line, therefore, this is a pro-defendant standard of care. It is hard to win negligence claims against children. Now, hard doesn't mean impossible. It is possible to win these claims. People do it. You can find the cases online. But if you're writing an essay, I would just keep in mind the nature of the standard of care makes it difficult for the plaintiff. What about an exception? All these duties rules have exceptions. Here's the exception. If a child is engaged in an adult activity, then we use the plain vanilla, reasonably prudent person default standard of care, not the special rule that we just went over. Adult activity, use RPP. Adult activity, use ordinary standard. And what is an adult activity? On the exam, operating a motorized vehicle. I know that sounds mindless, but pretty much nothing else really has been litigated to a sufficient degree that they will feel comfortable testing. Operating a motorized vehicle. Obviously, that includes a car, it includes a truck, it includes a motorcycle, but make sure your mind is open to other types of vehicles. Don't forget agricultural vehicles. Josh, who's 15, is operating a tractor. That's an adult activity. Don't forget watercraft. Sarah, who's 14, is operating a motorboat. That's an adult activity. Don't forget vehicles that are primarily used for fun. Jet skis, snowmobiles, all-terrain vehicles. All these things, motorized, it's an adult activity. Okay? So that's what we have in the realm of children. Let me take one more of these special standards of care for your consideration, and that will be the standard of care owed by professionals. Professionals get sued for negligence all the time. When they do get sued for negligence, those cases are called malpractice cases. Malpractice is not a legal term of art. It's just a category word. It's a negligence case. If you are ever confused on that point, I'm happy to dispel the confusion. A malpractice claim is not a separate claim. It's just a negligence claim against a professional. A professional can include any of the commonly known professions. The standard I'm about to give you applies to lawyers, accountants, architects, engineers, and most notably, and typically on the exam, healthcare providers. Doctors, dentists, chiropractors, and all the other flavors of people who take care of our physical well-being, our mental well-being, psychiatrists, psychologists as well, okay? Now, the standard of care that these individuals owe clients or patients is usually described as the care of an average member of the same profession providing similar professional services. They owe the care of an average member of the same profession providing similar professional services. The distinction between average and reasonable may not be apparent at first blush, but it is at the heart of the matter, so we have to take some time to explore it. The reasonably prudent person standard of care, the default standard of care, references a yardstick of comparison that is imaginary. The reasonably prudent person is hypothetical, fictional, pretend. It is a yardstick that exists in your head. When you want to know how the reasonably prudent person would behave in a given circumstances, you close your eyes and you imagine. When we change the wording to average, we are now referring to a real world standard of care. Now the yardstick is, how do others actually do it? It is a standard grounded in the real world. It is an empirical standard. How should a doctor do coronary bypass surgery? Open your eyes and look at how the other doctors do it. This standard of care is entirely different than the reasonably prudent person, because instead of comparing with an imagination, a hypothetical, a fictional standard or yardstick, we compare a professional to his or her colleagues. We compare to the peer group. The reason that we do this is that the legal system feels that it lacks the expertise to know how professionals should behave. A bunch of lawyers and a bunch of laypersons in the jury box don't know how to do coronary surgery. The standard for doing coronary surgery, therefore, is how other doctors normally do it. There are lots of other ways you can express this. You may find it congenial to think of this as a requirement that a professional be a conformist. It is a duty to conform. Conform to who? Conform to your professional colleagues. You may prefer to think of it as an obligation to follow professional custom. In the malpractice context, the custom of the profession sets the standard of care. You must do that which is customarily done. Now, there are a couple of things that follow from all of this. The first is that a plaintiff in a medical malpractice case or any other professional malpractice case, claim against a lawyer, claim against an accountant, almost always needs an expert witness. Because how are we going to know what is customarily done? The answer is we need to get somebody who is a member of the profession to come in and tell us what is customarily done. That has raised the question of where the expert may be from. Is it obligatory that the expert come from the same city or town as the defendant? And the answer is no. While at one time it was required that the expert be from the same community as the defendant, the majority of jurisdictions now take the view that the expert can be from anywhere in the country. If you're suing a doctor in Atlanta, you may get an expert from Chicago. If you're suing a doctor in small town upstate New York, you may get an expert from mid-Manhattan, New York City. The other thing that I want to tell you is really in the nature of a piece of exam-taking advice. And the exam-taking advice is that in the world of professional malpractice, when you're writing an essay answer, I would exhort you to avoid using the word reasonable. So many times I see people lapse into that. It's just a kind of a reflex. People will say the defendant must behave as a reasonable doctor. What you need to appreciate is that the word reasonable is not a casual word. It's a legal term of art, and it means imaginary. So what you are writing is that the defendant must behave as an imaginary doctor, and that's incorrect. The defendant must behave as a real world doctor. It's based on the custom of the profession. We look and see what others do. If doctors customarily give 30-year-old women who come in for a routine annual exam, if they normally give them a mammogram test, then the standard of care requires giving a mammogram as part of a routine physical to a 30-year-old woman. We don't close our eyes and imagine, and don't use the word reasonable. Because if you use the word reasonable, the grader does not know if you understand the material. Try to come up with that discipline. Use the word average, use the word conformist, say it's the custom of the profession, use any formulation but reasonable. Last point. Doctors owe a second and independent duty. This does not apply to any of the other professionals. Doctors owe a duty to disclose risks of treatment to a patient prior to embarking upon that treatment. You have to share information with a patient. This is the informed consent doctrine. If a doctor withholds that information, carelessly fails to share it, and if the risk in question then materializes, you'll have a claim. Let us say that there is a 1% chance, if I remove a tumor from your neck, that you might lose the ability to use your tongue. I'm supposed to tell you that in advance so that you can make a choice. You can say, I would rather live with the tumor than risk losing the ability to use my tongue. It would mean no speech. It would interfere with my ability to communicate with the people I love. That's too much to bear, even if it's only 1%. Now, if the doctor fails to give you the information and the operation goes off without a hitch and you don't lose function in your tongue, you don't have a claim. But doctors have a duty to make this disclosure. This, of course, is what we call the informed consent doctrine. Okay? So for those of you with me here today, I'm going to go ahead and let you go and enjoy what's left of the day, and we will resume when we see each other next. For those of you at home, ciao.